The stars beyond the viewport of the USS Enterprise had not changed. They never did, really. Cold and indifferent, scattered across the infinite black like the remnants of some ancient fire that had burned itself out long before humanity learned to look up and wonder. Captain James T. Kirk had spent the better part of his adult life among those stars, and in that time he had encountered things that defied explanation, beings that defied classification, and situations that defied every regulation in the Starfleet manual. He had faced godlike entities and cosmic horrors, had bargained with civilizations that made humanity look like children drawing in the dirt. He believed, with a particular brand of stubborn confidence that had made him the youngest captain in Starfleet history, that he had seen enough of the universe to be surprised by very little of it. He was wrong. It began, as so many impossible things did aboard the Enterprise, with an alert. Not the measured double tone of a standard sensor contact, not the calm chime of an incoming transmission. What erupted across every console on the bridge simultaneously was something the ship's computer had no formal category for. A cascading, overlapping shriek of conflicting data that sent Lieutenant Uhura's hands flying to her earpiece and made Ensign Chekhov half rise from his navigation console with an expression of genuine alarm. Every screen on the bridge flickered. The lights dropped for exactly 1.4 seconds, then surged back with an intensity that made several officers instinctively shield their eyes. The warp engines, humming faithfully at their standard cruising frequency, stuttered, a sound no engineer who had ever served aboard a starship wanted to hear, and then resumed, but at a slightly different pitch, as though the ship itself had been shaken and was recalibrating. At the center of it all, Kirk rose from his command chair. "Report," he said. The word was calm, controlled. That was the discipline of command. Whatever was happening in your chest, whatever instinct was screaming at the base of your spine, your voice stayed level. Your crew needed that levelness the way a ship needed its keel. Lieutenant Sulu's fingers moved across his helm console with practiced speed, pulling data from multiple sensor arrays at once. "Captain, we're reading a localized spatial distortion directly off the port bow, approximately 40 meters across, and..." As he paused, and Kirk recognized that pause. It was the pause of a competent officer encountering a reading he didn't trust. "Sir, it's not consistent with any known phenomenon. Not a wormhole, not a subspace tear, not a gravitational anomaly. The computer is classifying it as..." Another pause. Shorter this time, but heavier. "Unknown." "Unknown," Kirk repeated. "Yes, sir. The computer has no matching entry in its database." From the science station, the familiar voice of Commander Spock cut through the ambient noise of the struggling bridge systems with the precision of a scalpel. "Fascinating." He was bent over his hooded viewer, hands moving with unhurried efficiency across the sensor controls, layering scan after scan over the distortion as though he could eventually find the right frequency that would make it behave rationally. The distortion is generating energy readings across 17 distinct wavelength bands simultaneously, several of which should, by the established laws of physics, be mutually exclusive. It is also, he added, in precisely the same tone a man might use to note that it was raining, expanding. "How fast?" Kirk asked, already moving toward the science station. "Slowly, but with increasing acceleration. At current rate of expansion, it will intersect with our hull in approximately 4 minutes, 12 seconds. Spock straightened from the viewer and turned to face Kirk with those steady, dark eyes that had never once, not once in all the years Kirk had known him, shown fear. Calculation, yes. Concern occasionally. Never fear. "Captain, I would strongly recommend raising shields." "Shields up," Kirk said immediately. I'm not waiting for the suggestion to fully land before he was already acting on it. "Uhura, hail Starfleet Command. Tell them we have an unclassified spatial event and we're holding position to..." The distortion did not wait for him to finish the sentence. What happened next lasted approximately 8 seconds. In those 8 seconds, the Enterprise shuddered as though something enormous had seized it by the hull and given it a single contemptuous shake. Every console on the bridge went dark simultaneously, then blazed back to life in a cascade of emergency amber lighting. The view screen, which had been showing the distortion as a shimmering, vaguely translucent ripple against the starfield, went white. Pure, absolute white, the color of something that was not light in any natural sense, but was using light as a convenient disguise. And then it was over. The bridge systems returned to normal. The lights came back. The warp engines resumed their familiar hum at their familiar pitch. The view screen cleared. The distortion was gone. In its place, directly at the center of the main corridor junction on Deck 7, as confirmed by the internal sensors that Lieutenant Commander Scott was already reading from the engineering station with an expression of profound personal offense, was something the ship's computer was attempting to classify and failing repeatedly in a way that was itself unprecedented. "Scotty," Kirk said, his eyes on the sensor display that Spock was routing to the main view screen. "What are we looking at?" Montgomery Scott, chief engineer of the USS Enterprise, a man who had spent his career coaxing miracles out of warp cores and jury-rigged EPS conduits, looked up from his console with an expression that Kirk had never seen on his face before. It was not panic. Scotty didn't panic. It was something closer to the look of a craftsman who has just encountered a piece of machinery so far outside his experience that his entire professional framework has momentarily ceased to be useful. "Sir," Scotty said carefully, "the internal sensors are reading something on Deck 7 that weighs approximately 120 kilograms, stands roughly 2 meters tall, and is—" He trailed off, reading the display again, as though a second look might produce a more reasonable result. "It's encased in some kind of composite alloy armor. The sensors can't get a clean reading on the material. It's reflecting the scan like nothing I've ever seen. And the biological readings underneath the armor are—" Another pause. Scotty looked up. "They're off the charts, Captain. Whatever this is, it's not just human. It's not just anything." Spock had pulled up a secondary display alongside the sensor data, a rough, three-dimensional outline assembled from what the internal sensors could resolve. The shape it rendered was unmistakably humanoid, broad-shouldered, heavily armored, standing completely still in the corridor of Deck 7 with the particular, deliberate stillness of something that was not lost, not confused, not frightened, but was choosing to be still in the way that predators sometimes chose to be still, right before they decided to move. So Kirk studied the outline for a long moment. "Is it alive?" "Unquestionably," Spock said. "Heart rate is elevated but stable. Brain activity is extraordinary. The neural readings suggest a level of cognitive and physiological integration that I have not previously encountered. Whatever this being is, it is fully conscious, fully aware, and—" A fractional pause, which from Spock was the equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. "Is aware of our internal sensor sweep. It has detected that we are scanning it." "How can you tell?" Kirk asked. "Because," Spock said with careful precision, "it just looked up at the sensor node in the ceiling." The bridge was quiet for a moment. Kirk turned to Uhura. "Can we get a visual on Deck 7? "Switching to internal visual now," said Captain. The main view screen shifted from the external star field to the internal camera feed on Deck 7, Corridor Junction 7 Alpha. The image was clear. The lighting in the corridor was standard, warm, functional, the familiar pale gold of Enterprise interior lighting that Kirk could have identified in his sleep. Standing in that corridor, motionless, was something that did not belong in it. The armor was green, a deep, battle-scarred olive green layered over panels of darker composite material, bolted and riveted, and clearly not manufactured by any process that the Federation's industrial replicator systems would recognize. It was massive in the way that suggested the armor was not merely worn, but integrated, built around a body that had been engineered or transformed into something beyond standard human parameters. And the helmet was angular, utilitarian, with a visor that reflected the corridor lighting without revealing anything of the face beneath. There were marks on the armor, scratches, impact scoring, the kind of damage that accumulated not from a single battle but from hundreds of them, layered over years or decades, each one a record of something that had tried to stop this being and failed. In one hand, held with the casual ease of long familiarity, was a weapon. Large, bulky by the standards of Starfleet sidearms, clearly functional. The being was not pointing it at anything. Not yet. It stood in the corridor of the USS Enterprise, and it looked, there was no other word for it, it looked like it was taking inventory. Like it was cataloging its surroundings with the methodical efficiency of something that had been dropped into hostile territory so many times that the assessment process had become automatic, unconscious, as natural as breathing. McCoy's voice came over the intercom from sickbay, where he had apparently been watching the same feed. "Jim." His voice had a quality Kirk rarely heard from him. Not the theatrical exasperation that was his default register, not the warm gruffness he used when he was worried about a patient. This was something quieter, more careful. "Jim, I'm looking at the biological readings Spock is routing down here, and I want to be very clear with you that I do not know what I'm looking at, whatever that thing's body is doing under that armor. The metabolic rate, the neural activity, the cellular regeneration indices. I've never seen anything like it. This isn't a species I can find in any medical database. Human baseline maybe, somewhere underneath all of it, but human the way a warp core is fire. Same basic principle. Completely different order of magnitude." "Bones," Kirk said quietly, still watching the figure on the view screen. "Yeah. Is it dangerous?" A pause. When McCoy spoke again, there was something almost philosophical in his voice. The tone of a man who had just looked at a set of facts and followed them to a conclusion he found deeply uncomfortable. "Jim, if those readings are right, and I'm running them 3 times because I don't want them to be right, that thing could walk through our security teams the way you walk through a door. Not because it wants to, just because that's what it's built to do." On the view screen, the figure in the corridor had not moved. It was still taking inventory, still cataloging, its helmet tilted slightly, almost imperceptibly, toward the internal camera above it. It knew it was being watched. Kirk stood at the center of his bridge, looking at the feed, and felt the particular quality of silence that came when a situation had moved beyond the reach of standard procedure, and was waiting for him to decide what kind of captain he was going to be. He straightened his tunic, clasped his hands behind his back. "Mr. Spock," he said, "you're with me. Bones. Meet us on Deck 7. Security team." He thought about it for exactly 2 seconds, then made the call. "Stand by, but do not engage. I'm going to talk to it first." From the science station, where Spock raised one eyebrow in what anyone who knew him would recognize as the Vulcan equivalent of profound skepticism. "Captain, given the sensor readings, I am compelled to note that conventional diplomatic engagement may not be—" "It always works," Kirk said, already heading for the turbolift. Spock followed him. If he had an opinion about the wisdom of this plan, he kept it precisely where he kept all his opinions, behind those steady dark eyes, catalogued and filed, and not yet spoken aloud. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Trek universe, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. Live long and prosper, Deck 7 of the USS Enterprise was, under normal circumstances, one of the quieter sections of the ship. It housed crew quarters, a secondary storage bay, and a small auxiliary lab that Dr. McCoy occasionally commandeered when sickbay was running at capacity. The corridor junction at 7 Alpha was a crossroads point. 4 hallways meeting at a central hub, the kind of utilitarian intersection that existed purely for navigational convenience, and had never in the Enterprise's service history been remarkable for any reason whatsoever. It was remarkable now. Kirk stepped out of the turbo lift with Spock at his shoulder and stopped. He had seen the feed from the bridge. He had processed the sensor readings, absorbed McCoy's assessment, built a mental model of what he was walking toward. He was a man who prided himself on his ability to take information and translate it into readiness, to walk into any situation with his eyes open and his instincts calibrated. None of that preparation had fully accounted for the experience of standing in the same corridor as the DoomSlayer. It was not simply a matter of size, though the figure was larger in person than the sensor outline had suggested, broader across the shoulders, more densely constructed, the kind of physical presence that didn't just occupy space, but seemed to compress it slightly, the way a very large and very dense object affects the geometry of everything around it. It was not simply the armor, though the armor was extraordinary up close. Kirk could see details that the internal camera hadn't resolved, the layering of different composite materials, the deliberate engineering of overlapping protective plates, the wear patterns that told a story of sustained, repeated catastrophic combat survived through sheer refusal to fall. There were markings on the armor that weren't damaged, symbols, geometric patterns, etched into the surface with what appeared to be deliberate intent. Kirk didn't recognize any of them. What stopped him, more than any of the physical details, was the quality of attention the figure directed at him the moment he stepped into the corridor. The helmet turned. Smooth, controlled, no wasted motion. The visor oriented on Kirk with the precision of a targeting system, and what Kirk felt in that moment was not fear. He had made a private policy of not feeling fear in situations where fear was unproductive, but something adjacent to it, a very clear, very rational awareness that the thing looking at him was performing an assessment, and that the assessment was comprehensive, and that it was happening very, very fast. Kirk had been assessed by admirals, by alien dignitaries, by computer intelligences, and godlike beings, and everything in between. He knew what it felt like to be evaluated. This was different. This was the assessment of something that had spent an unknowable amount of time in environments where the speed and accuracy of that initial evaluation was the difference between survival and death, and had refined it accordingly until it operated less like a conscious process and more like a reflex, like breathing. The figure did not move. Kirk took 3 more steps forward, deliberately, unhurried, hands visible at his sides, an instinct that crossed species lines often enough to be worth the gesture. "I'm Captain James Kirk," he said. "This is my ship. You're aboard the USS Enterprise, a vessel of the United Federation of Planets." He kept his voice at a conversational register. Not loud, not soft. The voice he used when he wanted to establish normalcy in a situation that was anything but. "I don't know how you got here, and I'm guessing you don't entirely know either. But I'd like to start by telling you that nobody on this ship means you any harm." The corridor was silent except for the gentle, ever-present thrum of the Enterprise's systems, the subliminal pulse of the warp engines, the soft circulation of recycled air through the ventilation grids, the barely audible hum of the lighting panels. Sounds Kirk heard so constantly that they had long since dropped below the threshold of conscious perception. He heard them now. The figure did not respond. Not verbally. It didn't move. We didn't raise the weapon it was still holding at its side. Didn't make any gesture that Kirk could interpret as either acknowledgement or rejection. It simply continued to watch him with that precise, unblinking attention. From behind Kirk's left shoulder, Spock spoke quietly. "Captain, I am scanning continuously. The being's physiological readings remain stable. Elevated cortisol analogs consistent with heightened alertness, but no indicators of imminent aggressive action. It is, for the moment, choosing to listen." "Good," Kirk said, without taking his eyes off the figure. "That's something we have in common." He took another step forward. They were perhaps 4 meters apart now, close enough that Kirk had to make a conscious effort not to recalibrate his assessment of the figure's scale. Up close, the sheer physical reality of it was harder to intellectualize away. "I've encountered a lot of beings in my career," Kirk continued, keeping his tone easy, conversational, the tone of a man who was simply talking and happened to be doing it in a corridor on a starship with something that could apparently survive levels of combat that should by rights be fatal. Beings with abilities and histories that don't fit neatly into any of our categories. "I've learned not to make assumptions, so I'm not going to assume I know what you are, where you come from, or what you need. What I am going to do is offer you whatever help we can provide. Food, medical attention, information." He paused. "Communication, if we can figure out how." Nothing. The visor tracked him with absolute steadiness. Kirk heard the turbo lift open behind him and recognized the specific quality of McCoy's footsteps. Brisk, purposeful, carrying the slight additional weight of a medical kit. McCoy came up alongside him, took one look at the figure in the corridor, and to his credit, stopped walking without making a sound. His expression cycled through several distinct phases in the space of about 2 seconds. Surprise, reassessment, something that was professionally adjacent to fascination, even if personally it leaned toward alarm, and then settled into the particular focused calm that good doctors developed when they encountered something they didn't understand but needed to deal with anyway. "Lord," McCoy said quietly, just under his breath. Then to Kirk, also quietly, "Jim, I'm running a passive medical scan right now, and I want you to know that whatever I told you from sickbay about the readings being extraordinary, that was an understatement." "How much of an understatement?" Kirk asked, not looking away from the figure. "The kind where you use the word extraordinary because you don't have a word for the next category up." McCoy kept his voice low and professional, but Kirk could hear the edge underneath it. Not fear exactly, but the unsettled quality of a scientist whose working assumptions have just been comprehensively invalidated. The cellular regeneration rate alone. Jim, this being heals at a speed that makes Vulcan physiology look pedestrian. And the neural architecture is... He stopped. Started again. There are structures in there I don't have names for. When the brain is doing things that my scanner can detect but not categorize, and the musculature, the density, the fiber composition, it's not just that this being is strong, it's that it's built to be strong in a way that doesn't happen through normal biological development. This was made, shaped, over a very long time, by something. Or by itself, Spock offered quietly. The sensor data is consistent with a biological system that has been subjected to extreme and repeated physical stress over an extended period and has responded by adapting rather than failing. The cumulative result of thousands of such adaptations, layered over what may be decades or centuries, would produce readings consistent with what we are observing. Kirk let that sit for a moment. Decades, centuries, of combat, of surviving things that should have been unsurvivable, and adapting, and surviving the next thing, and adapting again. He looked at the armor, really looked at it, at every scratch and impact mark and layered repair, at the sheer accumulated record of it, and felt something shift in his understanding of what he was looking at. This was not a soldier, not in the conventional sense. This was something that had been forged by an experience so sustained and so extreme that it had moved beyond any category Kirk had a comfortable word for. He tried a different approach. You don't have to talk, he said. I know that might not be. I don't know what communication looks like for you, but if you can understand me, and I think you can, because you've been listening and you haven't moved, and I think if you decided this situation wasn't worth your patience, you would have made that clear already. Then I want you to know something. He took one final step forward, closing the distance to perhaps 2.5 meters. He was aware, well within the range at which the figure could reach him before any security response could intervene. He was choosing to be within that range. It was a calculated gesture, and like all of Kirk's calculated gestures, it had a genuine human impulse at its core. Whatever you've been fighting, you're not fighting it here. Not yet. And if something did follow you here, if that's what happened, then we'll face it together. That's what this ship does. The corridor hummed around them. The lights were steady. The air circulators breathed their quiet mechanical breath. And then something happened that none of them had predicted. The DoomSlayer moved. Not toward Kirk, not toward any of them. It turned, a precise, deliberate pivot, and faced the wall of the corridor to its left. For a moment, Kirk had no idea what it was doing, and his hand moved instinctively toward his phaser before he stopped it. The figure reached up with its free hand and pressed 2 fingers against the wall at approximately chest height. Not hard, not aggressively, with the deliberate, specific pressure of someone pointing at something. Spock's scanner chirped quietly. Captain, the being is indicating a section of the hull. A pause. The section it is indicating corresponds, on the other side of the bulkhead, to the direction of open space. Specifically, another pause. And this one was longer than any pause Spock had produced in recent memory. Specifically, the direction from which the spatial distortion originated. Kirk looked at the wall, looked at the figure. It came from out there, he said. Not a question. The figure held its position for exactly 3 more seconds. Then it lowered its hand and turned back to face Kirk. And something's still out there, Kirk said quietly. That's what you're telling me. No verbal confirmation. But the quality of the attention the figure directed at him in that moment was different from before. Still precise, still measuring. But something had shifted in it. A fractional adjustment that Kirk, who had spent his career reading beings across a vast spectrum of biology and culture and psychology, interpreted the way a good navigator interpreted a compass bearing. In not trust, not yet. Trust was earned, and this was a being that Kirk suspected had long since stopped extending it freely. But acknowledgement, recognition that Kirk was paying attention, that he had understood. McCoy leaned close to Kirk's ear. Jim, he murmured, I want to get this being into sickbay for a proper examination. Not because I think it needs medical attention. I'm not sure anything short of a planet could give it medical problems. but because I need to understand what I'm looking at. We all do. Agreed, Kirk said. He looked at the figure again. I'd like you to come with us, he said, keeping his voice level and direct. My medical officer needs to examine you. Not because we think something is wrong, but because understanding you is the first step toward helping you. And toward understanding what came through that distortion with you. He gestured down the corridor toward sickbay, an open, readable gesture. Come this way. The figure looked at him for a long moment. Then it looked at McCoy, then at Spock. The assessment was rapid and thorough and visibly comprehensive. Then it began to walk in the direction Kirk had indicated. McCoy exhaled beside Kirk, a long, controlled breath that was doing a great deal of work. Well, he said softly, that's either the best thing that's happened today or the beginning of the worst. With any luck, Kirk said, watching the armored figure move through the corridor with the contained, purposeful economy of something that had never wasted a single motion in its existence, it's both. He fell into step behind it, Spock at his side, and as he walked, he tapped his communicator. Kirk to bridge. Bridge, Sulu here, Captain. Begin long-range scans of the sector. Full spectrum. I want to know if anything else came through that distortion. Anything at all. He paused. And Mr. Sulu, if you find something, I want to know before it finds us. Aye, Captain. He closed the channel and kept walking, following the armored figure through the quiet, gold-lit corridors of his ship toward whatever came next. Sickbay on the USS Enterprise was, by the standards of the mid-23rd century, a marvel of medical engineering. Its diagnostic beds could map the complete biological architecture of most known species in under 4 minutes. Its analytical systems could cross-reference presenting symptoms against a database of over 40,000 documented conditions across more than 300 cataloged species. Dr. Leonard McCoy had, in this room, performed surgeries that the medical academies back on Earth had later incorporated into their curricula as case studies in improvisation under impossible conditions. He had treated Vulcans, Klingons, Andorians, Tellarites, and things that defied easy biological categorization. He had brought people back from the edge of death so many times that he had developed a private, complicated relationship with that edge, intimate with it in the way that only someone who has stood there repeatedly looking over can be. He had never had a patient quite like this. So the DoomSlayer stood in the center of sickbay and did not sit on the diagnostic bed. McCoy had gestured toward it, had explained its function in the calm, explanatory tone he used with patients who were unfamiliar with Federation medical technology. The figure had looked at the bed with the particular quality of attention it directed at everything, comprehensive, rapid, evaluative, and had then simply remained standing. Not aggressively, not as a challenge. It had assessed the bed, found it insufficient for some purpose that McCoy couldn't immediately identify, and filed the information away and moved on. McCoy had decided not to push the point. You picked your battles, what the DoomSlayer had permitted, and McCoy was already thinking of everything in terms of what was and was not permitted, which told him something important about the dynamic he was operating in was a passive scan. McCoy had held up the medical tricorder, demonstrated its function on himself first, then slowly, carefully extended the scan toward the armored figure. The figure had watched the device with an attention that suggested it was cataloging its technical specifications in real time, then had made no move to stop the scan from proceeding. What the scan returned made McCoy sit down. He didn't mean to. His legs simply made the decision independently of his higher cognitive functions and carried him backward to the stool at his instrument station, where he sat and looked at the readout and spent approximately 30 seconds doing nothing but reading and rereading the data to make sure he wasn't misinterpreting it. My Spock appeared at his shoulder with the inevitability of a natural phenomenon. Doctor? I see it, McCoy said. Your preliminary assessment? My preliminary assessment, McCoy said slowly, is that I need a larger preliminary. He scrolled through the data again. Spock, this being's baseline metabolic rate is running at approximately 4 times the human norm. Not because it's under stress. This appears to be its resting state. Its cardiovascular system is... I don't even want to call it a cardiovascular system because that implies a level of similarity to known biology that would be misleading. The heart, where there's one primary cardiac organ and 2 auxiliary structures that appear to serve a backup function, is pushing blood through a circulatory system that has been so extensively reinforced at the vessel wall level that I genuinely cannot find a mechanism by which conventional trauma could cause meaningful blood loss. The vessel walls are that dense. Spock processed this with the focused stillness he brought to all new information, consistent with an organism that has sustained repeated severe trauma and developed physiological countermeasures. Consistent with an organism that has sustained repeated severe trauma that would have killed anything else in the known universe, and developed physiological countermeasures that are frankly almost offensive in how effective they are. Yes, McCoy looked up from the readout. Wait, and that's before we get to the neural data. What does the neural data show? McCoy set down the tricorder and turned to face Spock fully. You know what a pain response inhibitor is? A neurological adaptation found in certain warrior species that reduces or eliminates the conscious experience of pain during high-stress situations. The Klingon nervous system possesses a limited version of this adaptation, this isn't a limited version, McCoy said. This being's nervous system has been modified. And I am using the word modified deliberately because this doesn't look like natural selection. This looks like something that was done to route pain signals in a way that I've never seen before. The signals are still generated. The tissue still knows it's damaged. But somewhere between the point of damage and the conscious processing centers, the signal is redirected, transformed. I can't tell you into what because the structures handling that transformation aren't in any neurological database I have access to. He paused. But here's the thing, Spock. The energy readings coming off those structures, they're not biological. They're not electromagnetic. They're not anything that falls within the standard physics framework I was trained in. Spock's eyebrow moved. You're suggesting an extra physical component to the being's neurology. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm describing what the scanner is telling me and trying very hard not to have a crisis about it. McCoy stood up, picked up the tricorder again, and turned back toward the figure that was still standing in the center of sickbay. We're still watching them with that steady, comprehensive attention. What I can tell you is this. Whatever this being has been through, whatever made it what it is, it left marks that go deeper than biology. There's something in there that my instruments can detect but cannot measure. And whatever it is, it's keeping this being functional in ways that no purely biological system could account for. Kirk, who had been standing near the doorway of sickbay, listening to all of this with his arms folded and his expression carefully composed, spoke for the first time since they had arrived. Is it in pain? McCoy looked at the readout again, looked at the figure. I don't think pain is a category that applies to it in the way it applies to you or me, he said finally. Oh boy, I think it has moved a very long way past pain. He thought about that for a moment. Which, Jim, is either a mercy or the saddest thing I've encountered in a long medical career, and I haven't decided which yet. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Spock moved away from McCoy's station and approached the center of sickbay, stopping approximately 3 meters from the figure. He held his scanner at a neutral angle, not pointing it at the DoomSlayer, but not concealing it either, a gesture of transparency if the figure was capable of reading it as such. I would like to attempt a more detailed analysis, Spock said, addressing the figure directly. Specifically of the armor you're wearing, I believe it contains materials and technologies that do not originate from any known civilization in Federation records. And understanding those materials may help us understand how you arrived here and what the spatial distortion was that brought you aboard. He paused. I recognize that what I am asking for is trust that we have not yet earned. I offer instead the observation that we have not acted against you when we had the opportunity to attempt to do so, and that our intentions in seeking this information are scientific rather than strategic. The figure regarded him. The quality of its attention directed at Spock had a slightly different character than it had when directed at Kirk. Something marginally more focused, as though Spock's manner of communication registered differently. Perhaps the directness, perhaps the absence of the emotional warmth that colored Kirk's interactions, even when he was being tactical. Whatever the reason, nowhere after a long moment, the figure reached up to its left forearm and pressed a recessed control that none of them had previously identified as a control. A small panel in the forearm armor released, a soft click of magnetic seals disengaging, and the figure held the panel out toward Spock. Spock accepted it carefully. He turned it in his hands, studying it with the focused attention he brought to all unknown objects. The material was immediately remarkable. It caught the light in a way that composite metals did not. the surface carrying a faint, almost organic texture beneath the obvious mechanical construction. His scanner moved across it in slow, methodical passes. "Extraordinary," he said quietly. It was the second time he had used that word since the DoomSlayer's arrival, and from Spock, our twice in an hour constituted something approaching effusive amazement. "Doctor, the alloy composition of this material includes elements I can identify, titanium derivatives, carbon polymer compounds, but also elements for which I have no spectral match in the Federation database, and the structural bonding at the molecular level is..." He tilted the panel slightly. "It has been reinforced at scales below what our replication technology can currently achieve. The intermolecular lattice structure is consistent with fabrication processes that would require energy inputs in environmental conditions we cannot currently produce." "Where does it come from?" Kirk asked. "That is precisely the question," Spock said, "and I cannot answer it with current data. What I can say is that the technology represented by this single panel of armor exceeds Federation material science in several significant respects, which raises the further question of what kind of civilization produced it and under what circumstances." He turned the panel over one more time. "And there is one additional anomaly." "Of course there is," McCoy said. "The material carries an energy signature that I have been attempting to classify since the DoomSlayer's arrival," Spock continued, ignoring the interruption with the practiced ease of long partnership. "It is present throughout the armor, in the biological readings, and, most notably, it was present in the spatial distortion that preceded the DoomSlayer's appearance aboard the Enterprise. I have now isolated it sufficiently to characterize it, though I must note that the characterization is itself deeply problematic." He lowered the scanner. "The energy signature does not correspond to any natural phenomenon in Federation physics. It does not correspond to any artificial energy system in our records. Its closest analog, and I use the word analog loosely because the similarity is structural rather than substantive, is the energy associated with certain Q continuum interactions." The name landed in the room with a particular weight. Kirk's expression shifted. A subtle tightening around the eyes that anyone who knew him would recognize as the specific look he got when a situation moved from complicated to significantly more complicated. "You're saying this has Q written on it?" "I am saying the energy signature shares structural characteristics with Q continuum energy in ways that are unlikely to be coincidental," Spock said carefully. "I am not saying Q was responsible for the spatial distortion. I am noting that the possibility cannot be eliminated with current data, and that if Q was involved, the implications of his interest in this particular being are worth considerable reflection." McCoy had gone very still. "Because if Q went out of his way to bring something here," he said slowly, "it's because he wanted to see what would happen. And Q's ideas about interesting things to watch tend to involve the Federation specifically." "That is an accurate summary of the available evidence regarding Q's behavioral patterns, yes," Spock said. Kirk uncrossed his arms. Well, he looked at the DoomSlayer, still standing, still watching, having made no movement during the entire exchange beyond tracking the speakers with that precise, comprehensive attention. It had watched them discuss it with the same quality of stillness it brought to everything else, not passive, waiting. "There is something I want to ask you," Kirk said to the figure, walking toward the center of the room until he was within 1.5 meters of it. Close enough that the physical reality of the figure's scale required a slight upward adjustment of his gaze. He held it steady. "And I want you to understand that I'm asking because I think the answer matters. Not for us, but for you." He paused. "What are you running from, or..." He considered the figure, the armor, the weapon, the quality of absolute, focused readiness that the figure carried around it like a second skin. "What are you running toward?" The sickbay was very quiet. Then, for the first time since its arrival aboard the Enterprise, the DoomSlayer did something entirely unexpected. It looked down, not away, not at the floor in the manner of avoidance or uncertainty. It looked down at its own hands, at the gauntleted fists that had, if the accumulated evidence of its biology and equipment were to be believed, fought and killed things that the Federation hadn't yet developed adequate language to describe. And it held that posture for approximately 4 seconds. Then it looked back up at Kirk, and from somewhere, from the deep, complex, extraordinary neural architecture that McCoy's scanner could detect but not fully map, something moved across the figure's body language, Honey, infinitesimal, almost unreadable. But Kirk read it because reading people was the skill that had kept him and his crew alive through more impossible situations than he cared to catalog. It wasn't running from anything. It had never run from anything. The question that drove it was not retreat. It was pursuit. Absolute, implacable, forward pursuit of something it had decided at some point so far back in its history that the decision had calcified into identity, must be destroyed. Kirk held the figure's gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, a small, simple acknowledgement that required no translation. Bridge to Captain Kirk. Sulu's voice, coming through the communicator, carried a quality that Kirk recognized instantly, not panic. The careful, controlled delivery of a man who had found something on his sensors and was maintaining professionalism by an act of deliberate will. Captain, long-range scans have detected an anomalous energy signature at bearing 315 Mark 7. It is consistent with the residual signature of the spatial distortion from 37 minutes ago. A pause. Sir, whatever it is, it's moving toward us. Kirk's hand was on his communicator before Sulu finished the sentence. Battle stations, I'm on my way. He looked at the DoomSlayer one final time. It seems, he said quietly, we're about to find out what followed you here. The figure's posture changed. A minute adjustment, barely visible, but the quality of its readiness shifted from monitoring to preparation, from inventory to intent. Kirk recognized that shift too. When he turned and moved toward the door at a pace that was not quite running, Spock fell in beside him. Behind them, the DoomSlayer followed. The bridge of the USS Enterprise under battle stations conditions was a different animal than the bridge under normal operations. The transformation was swift and total. Amber alert lighting replacing the standard warm gold, every station fully crewed, the ambient sound of the ship sharpening from its usual comfortable background, hum into something tighter, more purposeful. Every system brought to readiness with the practiced efficiency of a crew that had run this drill enough times to perform it in their sleep. Kirk came through the turbolift doors at a pace that transitioned seamlessly into his command stride. The particular walk that covered ground quickly without suggesting urgency, that communicated to his crew that the situation was serious and also that it was handled. Because the distinction between those two things was what kept a bridge crew functional under pressure. He registered the DoomSlayer entering behind him and saw, in his peripheral vision, the ripple of reaction that moved through the bridge crew. Controlled, professional, but present. Chekhov at navigation kept his eyes on his console with the focused discipline of someone making a deliberate choice. Uhura glanced once, categorized, returned to her communications board. Sulu, to his credit, did not look away from his sensor display at all, which Kirk noted and filed as an indicator of how seriously he was taking whatever was on that display. Report, Kirk said, dropping into the command chair with the ease of long habit. Sulu brought the long-range sensor data to the main view screen without preamble. What appeared there was not. He had first glance, dramatic. A sensor overlay, the familiar geometric grid of the Enterprise's scanning range, populated with the standard notation of stellar bodies and navigational reference points, with a single anomalous contact marked in red at bearing 315 Mark 7, currently at a range of approximately 200,000 kilometers and closing. It was the closing that mattered. Whatever it is, it's moving at approximately 1/4 impulse, Sulu said. No warp signature, no drive emissions of any kind that our sensors can identify. It's just moving through space, under its own power apparently, without any propulsion system we can detect. Kirk leaned forward slightly. Configuration? That's the problem. Yes, sir. Sulu pulled up the best visual resolution the sensors could achieve at 200,000 kilometers. What appeared on screen was not a ship. It was not a vessel of any configuration in the Federation's catalog. It was a shape, massive, irregular, and deeply wrong in the particular way that things were wrong when they had not been built according to any aesthetic or engineering philosophy that had ever touched the Federation's corner of the galaxy. It was dark. Not the dark of a powered-down ship or a stealth configuration, but the dark of something that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, that existed in space as an absence rather than a presence. Its edges were indistinct in a way that the sensor's visual processors kept trying to resolve and failing, or not as though the shape's boundaries were not entirely committed to being boundaries. Biological or mechanical, Kirk asked. The sensors can't determine, Sulu said, and there was something in his voice that he was controlling carefully. Every time we get a clean reading on its composition, the reading degrades before the computer can complete the classification. It's like trying to scan something that doesn't want to be scanned. From the science station, Spock had both hands moving across his console with an intensity that suggested he was running multiple parallel analyses simultaneously. Captain, I am detecting the same anomalous energy signature that I identified in the spatial distortion and in the DoomSlayer's armor and biological readings. It is emanating from the contact at significantly higher intensity. The readings are consistent with an entity, I use that word deliberately rather than vessel or object, that exists partially outside the standard four-dimensional framework of our universe. It is present in normal space, but not entirely contained by it. McCoy, who had followed them from sickbay and was standing to the left of the command area with his medical tricorder running continuously, looked up from the device. Spock, in plain language, what does that mean? It means, Spock said with the precise enunciation he used when translating complex physics for non-specialists, that the entity approaching us is not fully subject to the physical laws of this universe. Its presence here represents an incursion from a domain operating under different physical principles. And the interface between that domain and our own is what generated the spatial distortion we observed earlier. The same distortion that brought our guest aboard, Kirk said. Yes. Spock's hands stilled momentarily on the console. Captain, I believe I understand the sequence of events now. The DoomSlayer did not generate the spatial distortion independently. The distortion was generated by the entity approaching us. As a pursuit mechanism, it was, in essence, tearing open a path through dimensional boundaries in order to follow its quarry. A pause. The DoomSlayer crossed into our universe through the tear. The entity is now following through the same breach. The bridge was very quiet. Kirk turned in his command chair to look at the DoomSlayer, who had positioned itself near the rear of the bridge with the spatial awareness of something that always, automatically, found the position in any room that gave it the clearest sightlines and the most options. It was watching the main view screen. Its attention, which had been comprehensive and distributed since its arrival, was now entirely singular. Focused on the entity on the screen, with a quality of recognition that required no translation. It knew what that was. Can you tell us what we're looking at? Kirk asked, directing the question at the figure. No verbal response. But the DoomSlayer's right hand moved, a slow, deliberate gesture toward the view screen, then toward itself. Then, with a motion that was unmistakably the controlled expression of something vast and implacable, it raised its hand and made a single, forward-pushing motion. Kirk interpreted it. You've fought that before. The figure held still. And you came through whatever it opened. Kirk looked back at the view screen. And now it's here. He was quiet for a moment, processing the implications at the speed that crisis situations demanded. Not rushing the analysis, but not allowing himself the luxury of time he didn't have. Spock, if that entity tears a larger breach coming through, what are we looking at in terms of damage to local space? Spock's response was measured and careful in the way that careful responses were made when the underlying data was alarming. Based on the energy output I am currently reading, a full incursion by this entity into normal space would generate a spatial rupture of sufficient magnitude to, he paused, selected words, to render this sector uninhabitable. The rupture would propagate along subspace fault lines at a rate that would reach the nearest inhabited system within approximately 72 hours. Chekhov turned from his navigation console, his young face carrying the expression of someone doing rapid mental calculations and not enjoying the results. Captain, the nearest inhabited system is Cestus 3, Federation colony. Population approximately... I know where Cestus 3 is, Mr. Chekhov, Kirk said quietly. He sat with that for exactly the amount of time he needed to, then stood. Uhura, open a channel to Starfleet Command. Priority 1. I want to report this contact and request... He stopped. The view screen changed. The entity, which had been at 200,000 kilometers and closing at a measured pace, was no longer at 200,000 kilometers. It was at 50,000. It had covered 150,000 kilometers in the time it took Kirk to begin a sentence. Not at warp, not through any propulsion mechanism the sensors could identify. It had simply chosen to be closer, and it was. Shields, Kirk said. and the word was out before the thought was fully formed. Instinct taking over from deliberation at the speed that survival required. Full power, arm phasers and photon torpedoes. He was moving to the forward section of the bridge as he spoke, putting himself physically in front of the view screen, one in front of the image of the thing that was now close enough that the sensors were producing a visual resolution that made the earlier image look like a preliminary sketch. Up close, or what passed for close, at 50,000 kilometers, the entity was worse. It was large in the way that things were large when their scale was actively difficult for the human visual processing system to accept. Not large like a Borg cube, whose dimensions were extraordinary, but whose geometry was at least comprehensible. But large in a way that kept slipping away from clean measurement, as though its size was not a fixed property, but a variable one that the entity was adjusting as it moved. Its surface, if surface was the correct word for the boundary between the entity and surrounding space, was in constant motion. Not the mechanical motion of moving parts, but the organic, purposive motion of something alive and deliberate. Dark shapes moved within the larger darkness of its body with the autonomy of independent organisms, which might be exactly what they were. And it was looking at the Enterprise. Kirk could not have explained how he knew this. The entity had nothing resembling eyes in any configuration he could identify. But the quality of its attention, directed at the ship from 50,000 kilometers, was unmistakable. The sensors confirmed what his instincts told him. Energy readings from the entity spiked sharply the moment it came within visual range of the Enterprise, in a pattern consistent with active scanning. It was assessing them. Captain. Spock's voice carried something in it that was not quite urgency. Spock did not do urgency, but was the closest structural equivalent. I am reading a significant energy buildup within the entity. The pattern is consistent with preparation for an attack of some kind, though the mechanism is unlike any weapon system in our records. Evasive pattern Delta, Kirk said immediately. Take us to... He didn't finish the order. From the rear of the bridge, the DoomSlayer moved. It moved with a speed that was, given everything McCoy's scans had suggested about its physiological capabilities, perhaps not surprising in retrospect, but was in the immediate moment simply shocking. A sudden transition from absolute stillness to rapid, a purposive motion that covered the distance from the rear of the bridge to the forward section in a time that left no opportunity for anyone to react. It came to a stop beside Kirk, close enough that Kirk was acutely aware of the physical reality of it. The scale, the contained, focused energy of a body that had been built and maintained for one specific purpose. It was looking at the view screen, at the entity, at the energy buildup that Spock had identified. Then it looked at Kirk, and for the first time since its arrival, the DoomSlayer communicated something unambiguous. Not through words, not through gesture exactly, through the quality of its attention, through the way it positioned itself between Kirk and the view screen with a deliberateness that could not be misread. It was telling him something. It was telling him that it recognized what was coming, that it had seen this before, that whatever the entity was preparing to do, the DoomSlayer had faced it, or something like it, before, and was still standing, still here, still intact, and it was positioning itself at the forward section of the bridge of the Enterprise in a way that made its intention as clear as any spoken declaration. It was not retreating, it was not advising retreat. It was standing between the crew of the Enterprise and what was coming, in the manner of something that had made this particular stand so many times that the posture was as natural as breathing. Kirk looked at it for exactly 1 second. Then he turned back to the view screen and made his decision in the way he always made his best decisions. Quickly, clearly, and without second-guessing. Sulu. It will hold our position. Sulu glanced back. Sir? We're not running, Kirk said. Not yet. Not until we understand what we're dealing with. He kept his eyes on the view screen, on the entity that was still building energy, still assessing, still making whatever calculations governed its behavior. Spock, can we communicate with it? Unknown, Spock said. The universal translator has no framework for its signal emissions. However, I am detecting modulated energy patterns within the buildup that share structural characteristics with communication signals across several known species. It is possible that what we are interpreting as a weapons buildup is, at least in part, a communication attempt. At least in part, McCoy said from the edge of the bridge. That's a very significant qualifier, Spock. It is, Spock agreed, on with complete equanimity. I mention it because the alternative, that it is entirely weapons buildup, leads to a course of action that I suspect the captain has already decided against. Kirk almost smiled. Uhura, try every band we have. Standard first contact protocols, let it know we're listening. He looked at the view screen, at the vast, dark, incomprehensible thing that had followed the DoomSlayer through a tear in dimensional space and was now 50,000 kilometers from his ship, building toward something. And whatever it says back, he added quietly, record everything, every frequency, every energy pattern, every modulation, because we're going to need to understand this thing. And if it doesn't want to talk, Sulu asked carefully. Kirk's hand rested on the back of the command chair. Beside him, Ma the DoomSlayer stood with the stillness of a drawn weapon. Then, Kirk said, we'll deal with that too. On the view screen, the entity pulsed, a deep, resonant wave of dark energy that the ship's sensors captured in 17 simultaneous wavelength bands and that the universal translator received, processed, and returned with a classification that made Uhura press both hands against her earpiece and go very still. Captain, she said carefully, I have something. Put it on speaker. What filled the bridge was not sound in any conventional sense. It was pressure, a felt thing, a vibration that existed at a frequency below hearing and above it simultaneously, that moved through the hull of the ship and through the bodies of everyone on the bridge with the intimacy of something that did not distinguish between the ship and its crew. And it lasted 4 seconds. Then it stopped. The bridge was very quiet. Translation? Kirk asked. Uhura took a breath. The translator is doing its best with a signal type it has no prior reference for, she said, but the closest approximation it can produce. She looked up from her console. Her expression was the expression of someone reading a translation and wishing they weren't. The closest approximation is 2 words, Captain. She read them. Kirk looked at the view screen. Beside him, the DoomSlayer's posture had not changed. It had heard the message. It had heard the message before, Kirk suspected, more times than either of them could count. It had heard it, and it was still here, still standing, still facing forward. Kirk decided that was enough of an answer for now. Uhura, he said, send a response. Standard greeting. Tell it this ship and its crew are not its concern. He paused. Tell it we have something it's looking for. McCoy stared at him. Jim, it followed him here, Bones, Kirk said quietly, which means it wants him, which means, for the moment, we have something it wants. And in my experience, he looked at the view screen one final time before turning back to his command chair. That's called leverage. He sat down. Now, he said, let's see if it knows what that means. The response from the entity came not through the communication system, but through the hull. It was not an attack. Kirk established that certainty in the first 2 seconds by the simple metric that the Enterprise was still intact. Shields holding, structural integrity nominal. No damage reports from any deck. What it was instead, Hado was something that the ship's sensors had no established category for, and that every member of the bridge crew felt simultaneously in the way that certain very low frequencies were felt rather than heard. A deep, resonant transmission that moved through the hull plating and the deck beneath their feet and the air in their lungs with the intimacy of something that did not experience the boundary between a ship and its occupants as meaningful. Uhura had both hands on her console, running the signal through every analytical filter the communication system possessed. Her face had the concentrated stillness of someone translating not just language, but an entire framework of communication that had been built on assumptions incompatible with her own. It's responding, she said. The translator it's struggling, and the signal structure doesn't map onto any linguistic architecture in the database. It's not organized the way language is organized. It's more like, she paused, searching for the right word, like intent, direct intent, without the intermediary of grammar or syntax. The meaning isn't encoded in the signal is the meaning. What is it intending? Kirk asked. Uhura was quiet for a moment. Her hands moved across the console with careful precision. The closest the translator can render it is, she stopped. Tried again. Surrender, return, or, a longer pause, consumption. The bridge absorbed this. McCoy, from his position near the port side of the command area, made a sound that was not quite a word but communicated a fully formed opinion about the situation. Chekhov, at navigation. R had gone very still in the manner of someone maintaining professionalism through an act of considerable will. Sulu's hands were on his helm controls with the light, ready touch of a pilot who was prepared to move the ship the instant the order came and was choosing not to move it yet because the order had not come. Kirk looked at the DoomSlayer. The figure had not moved from its position at the forward section of the bridge. It was watching the view screen with the focused, singular attention it had directed at the entity since the moment the contact appeared on sensors. The attention of something that had been in this specific situation before, or situations close enough to this one that the differences were navigational rather than fundamental. Surrender, return, or consumption. And the DoomSlayer had heard some version of that offer before. Presumably, many times, the evidence of its continued existence suggested its response had been consistent. "It's not going to negotiate," Kirk said. It was not quite a question. "Based on the signal structure," Spock said from the science station, where he had been running continuous analyses since the transmission began, "I would assess the probability of meaningful negotiation at approximately 3.4%. The entity's communication does not appear designed for exchange. It is designed for declaration. It is telling us what will happen, not proposing alternatives." He looked up from his viewer. However, there is a secondary component to the transmission that is worth noting. The entity is not directing its full attention at the Enterprise. When the primary focus of its energy output, its scanning, its communication, its apparent intent, is directed at the DoomSlayer specifically. We are, to use an imprecise but functional analogy, in the way. So it doesn't actually want the ship, Kirk said. "It wants what is on the ship," Spock confirmed. "We represent an obstacle rather than a primary objective. This is both reassuring and concerning. Reassuring because it reduces the immediate threat to the Enterprise, and concerning because the methods an entity of this nature might employ to remove an obstacle between itself and its primary objective are unlikely to be gentle." Kirk nodded slowly. He was running calculations of his own. Not the mathematical kind that Spock ran with effortless precision, but the human kind. The kind that weighed variables that didn't fit neatly into equations. What he had, what the entity had, what each side wanted, where the leverage was and how long it would hold. What he had at this moment was a being of extraordinary capability that the entity wanted badly enough to tear holes between dimensions to pursue. What the entity had was size, power, and apparent indifference to the laws of physics as the Federation understood them. What Kirk wanted was to get his ship and crew through this intact, while also, ideally, not simply handing the DoomSlayer over to something that had communicated its intentions in terms of surrender and consumption. The leverage was real. The question was how to use it. "Spock," he said, "the entity's energy buildup that you detected earlier, the one that preceded the transmission. Has it continued?" "It has stabilized," Spock said. "The buildup is present but no longer increasing. The entity appears to be in a holding pattern, consistent with awaiting a response to its transmission." "It's waiting for an answer," Kirk said. "That would be the most logical interpretation, yes." Kirk stood up from the command chair and moved to the forward section of the bridge, standing beside the helm and navigation consoles, close to the view screen. Close to the image of the thing that was holding 50,000 kilometers off the Enterprise's port bow, and waiting for an answer to a message that had offered 3 options, 2 of which were the same option phrased differently, and 1 of which was not an option Kirk intended to entertain. He looked at the DoomSlayer. "I need to know something," he said. "Not because I'm going to act against you. I want to be clear about that, but because I can't make good decisions without good information." He held the figure's gaze steadily. "What is that thing? What does it actually want with you?" The DoomSlayer was still for a long moment. Then, with the deliberate economy of a being that had long since reduced everything to its essential components, it moved. It raised its right hand and held it flat, horizontal, at approximately chest height. Then it moved the hand downward, slowly, with weight behind the gesture. Down, below the level of the deck, into something beneath. Kirk understood. It came from below, from something beneath. Beneath normal space? Another dimension? A fractional inclination of the helmeted head. "And it wants you back there." Kirk paused. "Why? What are you to it?" The DoomSlayer lowered its hand. It was still for another long moment. Then it did something that surprised Kirk. It looked down at itself, at the armor, at the weapon it carried, at its own hands. The same gesture it had made in sickbay, when Kirk had asked what it was running toward, but with a different quality to it now. Not the reflective pause of before. Something more specific, more deliberate. It was telling him something about what it was. "You're a threat to it," Kirk said quietly. "Not just a prisoner it wants back. A genuine threat. Something it needs to contain, because if it doesn't..." He stopped, reconsidered. "Because if you're free, you can fight it." The quality of stillness that answered him was itself a kind of confirmation. Kirk turned back to the view screen. The entity hung there in the darkness between stars, vast and patient, and communicating its intentions in terms of geological inevitability. He thought about what Spock had said, that a full incursion into normal space would render this sector uninhabitable, would propagate along subspace fault lines, would reach Cestus 3 in 72 hours. He thought about the two words the translator had managed to extract from a signal type it had no framework for. He thought about a being that hell, or whatever this entity represented, had chased across dimensional boundaries because it was genuinely afraid of what that being could do to it. He made his decision. "Uhura," he said, "send another response. Tell it the individual it's seeking is under the protection of the United Federation of Planets and will not be surrendered." He paused. "And tell it that if it attempts to board this vessel or attack it, it will be met with the full defensive capability of a Starfleet vessel." Another pause, shorter this time. "And tell it that we are willing to discuss a peaceful resolution to this situation." McCoy made a sound. "Jim, you just told a dimensional horror entity that we're protecting its most wanted fugitive and then offered to talk about it peacefully. Do you hear yourself?" "Clearly," Kirk said. "Spock, while we wait for a response, what can phasers actually do to that thing?" Spock considered this with appropriate care. "Unknown," he said. "The entity exists partially outside normal space, which means conventional energy weapons may have reduced or negligible effect on the portions of its structure that are not fully present in our dimensional framework. Should photon torpedoes present similar uncertainties. However," he turned back to his viewer, making several quick adjustments to his sensor analysis. "I have been studying the energy signature that the entity and the DoomSlayer share. It is present in both, but in significantly different configurations. In the entity, it is ambient and distributed. In the DoomSlayer, it is concentrated, focused, and, this is the element I find most significant, it appears to be a refined or processed version of the same energy, as though the DoomSlayer has not merely been exposed to this energy, but has learned over an extended period to generate and direct it." Kirk looked at the DoomSlayer. "You can hurt it." No response, but the figure's posture had shifted. That minute, barely perceptible adjustment that Kirk was beginning to learn meant that he had understood correctly. "Which is why it wants you contained," Kirk said. "Which is why it followed you here." He was thinking rapidly now, the pieces arranging themselves into a pattern. "Spock, if the DoomSlayer is capable of generating energy that affects this entity in ways our weapons can't, and if we could somehow amplify or direct that capability using the ship's systems..." "An interesting theoretical avenue," Spock said carefully, "though one that raises significant practical questions about how such an amplification would be achieved, given that we do not yet fully understand the mechanism by which the DoomSlayer generates the relevant energy." "That's what the next few hours are for," Kirk said. He turned to face the full bridge crew. Sulu, Chekhov, Uhura, the relief officers at the secondary stations, all of them running at the focused, professional intensity that battle stations demanded. These were his people. He had served with most of them long enough to know not just their capabilities, but their characters, the specific qualities of courage and competence and commitment that each of them brought to their station. "We are going to figure this out," he told them. "We have what that thing wants, which means we have time. We're going to use that time to understand what we're dealing with and find a way to deal with it. That is what this crew does." It was not a speech. Kirk did not give speeches. It was a statement of fact, delivered in the tone of a man who believed it completely. He turned back to the view screen. The entity was still there, still holding, still waiting. Then Chekhov's console lit up with a contact that had not been there 30 seconds ago, and the ensign's voice carried the specific controlled alarm of someone who had found something unexpected and was managing his reaction by an act of professional discipline. Captain, new contact, bearing 170 Mark III, declination -12. Range, he checked the reading twice, range 400,000 kilometers and closing. Kirk was at his shoulder in 3 steps. Configuration? Chekhov brought the contact to the main view screen alongside the entity. What appeared there was immediately and unmistakably identifiable, the distinctive, predatory silhouette of a Klingon D-7 class battlecruiser, running at high warp and decelerating sharply as it approached sensor range. The ship's configuration was standard. Its IFF signal was not. It was broadcasting on a modified frequency, cycling through encryption patterns that the Enterprise's computers identified as Klingon military tactical encryption, the kind used when a vessel did not want its communications intercepted. It was not trying to hide its presence. Its presence was unambiguous. It was trying to hide what it was saying. "They've been monitoring us," Kirk said. Not a question, a realization. They picked up the distortion. They followed it. He straightened up. "Uhura, are they hailing?" "Not yet, sir." Uhura had one hand on her earpiece, monitoring the Klingon frequency with the concentration of someone trying to read a book through a frosted window. "They're transmitting internally, heavily encrypted, but..." She paused, her expression sharpening. "Captain, yeah, I'm getting partial intercepts. The encryption is good but not perfect. I'm catching fragments." She was quiet for a moment, listening. "They're talking about us, about the entity, and about..." She stopped. "About what, Lieutenant?" She looked up. "About the being aboard our ship. They've got sensor records of it. Long-range scans taken when it first appeared." She paused. "They're calling it a weapon, sir. They're debating who it belongs to." Kirk looked at the view screen, the entity on the left, vast and patient, and waiting for an answer to its ultimatum. The Klingon battle cruiser on the right, decelerating into tactical range, crewed by warriors who had apparently decided that the most interesting thing about a dimensional incursion and an entity that existed partially outside normal space was the extremely dangerous individual aboard the Federation starship. He looked at the DoomSlayer. The figure was looking at the Klingon ship. Its head had turned when the contact appeared. That automatic comprehensive orientation toward new variables that seemed to be as involuntary for it as blinking was for a human being. It was assessing the new contact with the same focused efficiency it had brought to every assessment since its arrival. Then it looked at Kirk. There was something in the look that Kirk interpreted. With the particular fluency he was developing for reading a being that communicated entirely through the quality of its attention and posture. As a very dry, very ancient, very wearied version of the observation that situations had a way of becoming more complicated. Kirk almost smiled. "Mr. Sulu," he said, "keep us between the entity and the Klingon vessel. I don't want either of them getting a clear approach to the other without going through us first." He moved back to the command chair. "Uhura, open a channel to the Klingon ship. Standard frequency." "Channel open, sir." Kirk sat, straightened, put on the particular expression he used when talking to Klingons. Direct, respectful of their culture's framework without being deferential to it, carrying the implicit communication that he was a man worth taking seriously. "Klingon vessel, this is Captain James Kirk of the USS Enterprise. I'm aware you've been monitoring our situation. I'd like to suggest that before either of us makes any decisions about what's happening in this sector, we have a conversation." He paused. "In my experience, the conversations you have before you do something are considerably more productive than the ones you have after." The channel was quiet for a moment. Then a voice came back, deep, measured, carrying the particular cadence of a Klingon who was choosing his words with the care of someone who considered language a tactical instrument. "Captain Kirk." The name landed with the weight of recognition. Kirk's reputation in Klingon space was, to put it mildly, known. "I am Commander Kor of the Imperial Klingon vessel Klothos. I have been observing your situation with considerable interest." A pause. "The being aboard your ship, our sensors have analyzed it. Tell me, Kirk, is it yours or merely your problem?" Kirk looked at the DoomSlayer. "Neither," he said. "It's its own." A longer pause from the Klingon end. "Then," Kor said, and there was something in his voice that sounded genuinely interested in a way that Klingon commanders rarely allowed themselves to sound genuinely interested. Perhaps we do have something to discuss. Section 6. Commander Kor of the Imperial Klingon vessel. Klothos was not, by the standards of his people, a patient man. Patience was not a virtue that the Klingon warrior code celebrated with particular enthusiasm. It ranked considerably below courage, honor, even the glorious prosecution of battle in the hierarchy of qualities a Klingon commander was expected to embody. But Kor was also not a simple man, and he had survived long enough in the brutal, complex ecosystem of Klingon military politics to understand that there was a difference between patience and strategy, and that the latter sometimes required the temporary adoption of the former as a tactical posture. He was being strategic now. The image on the Enterprise's view screen was sharp and clear. The interior of the Klothos's bridge rendered in the distinctive aesthetic of Klingon military design, all hard angles and dark metals, and the specific quality of lighting that seemed to have been calibrated to make everyone on a Klingon bridge look like they were perpetually on the verge of making a decision that would be violent. Kor himself occupied the center of the frame with the ease of a man who had held command long enough that authority had stopped being something he performed and had become something he simply was. He was broad-featured, sharp-eyed, carrying the accumulated weathering of a career spent in combat and politics in roughly equal measure. There was a scar along his left jaw that had not been there the last time Kirk had encountered him, which told its own story. He was looking at the DoomSlayer with an expression that Kirk recognized, not as the calculating hunger of a predator assessing prey, but as the focused, assessing look of one warrior evaluating another. Professional. Respectful in the specific way that Klingon respect operated, which was less about warmth and more about acknowledgement of capability. Remarkable, Kor said, and the word was quiet, directed less at Kirk than at the figure standing at the forward section of the Enterprise's bridge. Our sensors recorded it when it first appeared. The readings were... He paused, and Kirk had the distinct impression that Kor was selecting a word that his warrior's vocabulary didn't make easy. Unprecedented. In 30 years of service, I have not seen biological readings of that magnitude from a single organism. He pulled his gaze from the DoomSlayer and directed it at Kirk. What is it? We're still working on that, Kirk said. What I can tell you is that it arrived through the same dimensional distortion that you presumably detected when you altered course to investigate, and that, he gestured toward the entity that remained visible at the left of the split view screen. Armor still holding at 50,000 kilometers, still waiting with the geological patience of something that experienced time differently than biological organisms. Came through after it, or is trying to. Kor's eyes moved to the entity. His expression underwent a subtle but significant shift. Not fear. Klingon commanders did not do fear in any form that was externally readable, but the specific recalibration of a man who has looked at something and updated his threat assessment in a direction he did not find entirely comfortable. We analyzed it as well, he said. Our sensors cannot fully resolve its composition. It exists in a state that our instruments were not designed to measure. He paused. What does it want? It sent us a message, Kirk said. The translation came out as 3 options: surrender, return, or consumption. Our 2 of those are the same option. Kor was quiet for a moment. Then, in a tone that carried the particular quality of a Klingon warrior acknowledging a situation that he found both alarming and on some level invigorating. It hunts the being aboard your ship. Yes, and the being aboard your ship has been fighting it for some time by the look of it. Kor's eyes moved back to the DoomSlayer. The armor, the weapon, the biological readings our sensors captured. He leaned slightly forward in his command chair. That being has been at war, a long war, longer, I would estimate, than either of us has been alive. That's our assessment too, Kirk said. Kor was silent for a moment longer. On the Klothos's bridge behind him, Kirk could see the movement of Klingon officers at their stations. Controlled, purposive, in the disciplined activity of a crew on tactical alert. He could also see, in the body language of several of those officers, the particular quality of attention they were directing at the view screen, at the image of the Enterprise's bridge, at the DoomSlayer. It was the attention of warriors who had identified something worth looking at. Kirk, Kor said finally, I will be direct with you, because I find directness more efficient than the alternative, and because the situation does not appear to allow for significant time expenditure on diplomatic performance. He straightened in his chair. The High Council has been monitoring this sector. The spatial distortion was detected by our long-range sensors 40 minutes before your ship encountered it. I was dispatched to investigate into a brief pause. None acquire any assets of strategic value that the distortion might produce. Acquire, Kirk said, meaning the being aboard my ship. That was the initial assessment of its strategic value, yes. Kor said it without apology or evasion, which was, in its way, a form of respect. A being of that biological capability, that apparent combat effectiveness, the military applications are obvious. They always are, Kirk said, keeping his voice level. And now? Kor looked at the entity again, the vast, dark, patient thing that existed partially outside the universe they were all standing in. Now, he said slowly, the strategic calculation has become more complex. He returned his gaze to Kirk. That entity followed the being here, through a dimensional boundary, with the apparent intention of retrieving it by whatever means are necessary. He let that sit for a moment. If it is willing to tear holes between dimensions to recover one being, it is not simply a pursuer. It is invested, deeply invested, which means the being it is pursuing is worth the investment, Kirk finished. Yes, a being worth that level of investment, Kor said carefully, is not a weapon to be acquired, Kirk. It is a variable, an unpredictable, extraordinarily dangerous variable. And the entity pursuing it, he looked at it one more time. That is not a threat the Klingon Empire has a current strategic framework for addressing. Our weapons may be as ineffective against it as yours. Spock, Kirk said, without looking away from the view screen. Klingon disruptor technology operates on similar physical principles to Federation phaser technology, Spock said from the science station. Given the entity's partial existence outside normal dimensional space, the probable effectiveness of Klingon weapons against it is comparable to our own, which is to say, uncertain at best and negligible at worst. Kor absorbed this with the composure of a man who had received bad tactical news before and had developed a functional relationship with it. Then we have a shared problem, he said. It appears so, Kirk agreed. The channel was quiet for a moment. On the split view screen, the entity pulsed, another of those deep, resonant waves of dark energy that moved through the Enterprise's hull and was felt rather than heard. It had been doing this at irregular intervals since the initial transmission, each pulse slightly different from the last in ways that Uhura was recording and analyzing with continuous, focused attention. Whether they were repeated demands, status updates, or something else entirely remained unclear. The DoomSlayer reacted to each pulse in the same way. A fractional orientation toward the entity, a brief intensification of that focused, comprehensive attention, then a return to its baseline monitoring posture. Kirk had been watching this pattern since the first pulse. The figure clearly understood the pulses in ways that the universal translator could not yet fully render. It was reading them as a native reader reads text, not decoding, but comprehending. Commander Kor, Kirk said, making his decision. And I want to propose something. I expected you would, Kor said. There was something almost dry in his tone. You have a reputation for proposals in inconvenient situations, Kirk. The entity is a problem neither of us can currently solve alone, Kirk said. Our weapons may be ineffective against it. Your weapons probably are too. But we have something aboard this ship that can affect it. Something the entity is afraid of, or it wouldn't have followed it across dimensional boundaries. He glanced at the DoomSlayer. If we can find a way to work with what we have rather than around it, we have a chance of resolving this situation in a way that doesn't end with a sector-wide spatial rupture and 72 hours of propagation time to Cestus 3. Kor's eyes narrowed slightly. So you're proposing a temporary alliance. I'm proposing a shared tactical objective, Kirk said, which is not quite the same thing, but is probably more palatable to both of us. A pause. Kor looked at the entity, looked at the DoomSlayer, looked back at Kirk with the expression of a man running calculations that were partly mathematical and partly philosophical, and partly the specific, inarticulate calculus of a warrior deciding whether a situation was honorable enough to engage with on its own terms. There is a condition, Kor said. There usually is, Kirk said. The being aboard your ship, Kor said, if it survives what is coming, and based on what our sensors show of its capabilities, I assess that probability as high. I want to meet it, face to face, not to acquire it, not to negotiate its service to the Empire. He paused, pointing to look it in the eye, warrior to warrior. I want to know what manner of thing has fought that. He gestured toward the entity, the gesture brief and sharp and carrying the particular weight of a Klingon, acknowledging something that impressed him against his better judgment. And is still standing. Kirk looked at the DoomSlayer. The figure had been listening to the entire exchange with its customary comprehensive attention. It had tracked the conversation between Kirk and Kor with the same focused efficiency it brought to everything. Not passive reception, but active analysis. Building understanding from context and tone, and the physical cues that cross species lines often enough to be readable. It was looking at Kor now, through the view screen, across 50,000 kilometers of space and a significant cultural gulf. The DoomSlayer and the Klingon Commander were looking at each other with an quality of mutual assessment that Kirk found deeply interesting. Two beings whose primary relationship with existence had been defined by combat. Looking at each other from opposite sides of a screen, each one reading the other with the professional thoroughness of long experience. Kor, on his bridge, sat very slightly straighter. The DoomSlayer, on the Enterprise's bridge, inclined its head. A small, controlled movement. Barely perceptible, but deliberate. Kor saw it. Something shifted in his expression. Something that, on a Klingon commander's face, constituted, in its restrained way, profound respect. It understands us, he said, quietly for a Klingon. More than we understand it, probably, McCoy said, from his position near the port side of the bridge. Among in the tone of a man making an observation, he found equal parts fascinating and unsettling. Commander Kor, Kirk said, we have a condition of our own. Kor returned his attention to Kirk. Speak. Whatever comes next, whatever we decide to do about that entity, the DoomSlayer is not a weapon to be pointed. It's not an asset to be deployed. It makes its own choices. Kirk kept his voice level and direct, the tone he used when he was saying something he meant completely and wanted received completely. We work alongside it, not with it as an instrument. If that's acceptable to you, then yes, temporary shared tactical objective. If it's not, he spread his hand slightly. Then we deal with what's out there independently and compare notes afterward. Kor studied him for a long moment. Then he looked at the DoomSlayer one more time, with the expression of a man revising his framework in real time. A being that fights that, another brief gesture toward the entity, is not a weapon, he said slowly. A weapon does not choose its battles. It is chosen. He paused. Your condition is acceptable, Kirk. Good, Kirk said. He leaned forward slightly. Then let's talk about what we're actually dealing with. What followed was 37 minutes of the most concentrated analytical work the Enterprise's senior staff had produced under field conditions. Spock coordinated with both the Enterprise's science systems and through a communications relay that Uhura established with considerable technical ingenuity, with whatever scientific instrumentation the Klothos possessed, which was less sophisticated than Starfleet's, but different enough in its design philosophy that it was capturing aspects of the entity that the Enterprise's sensors were missing. McCoy cross-referenced his biological scans of the DoomSlayer against Spock's energy analysis, building a picture of the relationship between the Slayer's physiology and the entity's energy signature, with the dogged, intuitive thoroughness that made him, in Kirk's private assessment, one of the finest diagnostic minds in Starfleet, regardless of his frequent protestations to the contrary. The picture that emerged was both clearer and more alarming than what they had started with. The entity, Spock said, pulling his analysis together with the precision of someone who had been building toward a conclusion and was now arriving at it, is not a discrete organism in the conventional sense. It is better understood as a manifestation, a concentrated expression of the energy system from which it originates. The same system that the DoomSlayer has been engaging throughout what appears to be an extended campaign across multiple dimensional theaters. He paused. This particular manifestation is not the source of that energy system. It is an emissary of it, an instrument of retrieval. There's something larger behind it, Kirk said. Significantly larger, Spock said. The energy readings I am detecting suggest that what we are observing is the dimensional equivalent of a scout. A powerful one, certainly, as capable of tremendous destructive effect if it fully crosses into our dimensional framework, but not the primary force it represents. He looked at Kirk with those steady dark eyes. If this entity fails to retrieve the DoomSlayer, or is destroyed in the attempt, the response from whatever sent it may be of considerably greater magnitude. The bridge absorbed this in silence. So if we beat it, Sulu said carefully from the helm, something bigger comes. That is a reasonable summary of the probability matrix, yes, Spock said. McCoy set down his tricorder with the precise, controlled movement of someone managing his reaction carefully. Well, he said, that's a wonderful thing to know. He looked at the DoomSlayer. Is that what you've been dealing with? Every time you fight something back, something bigger shows up? The DoomSlayer looked at him. The quality of that look, the ancient, immeasurably tired, and yet utterly undefeated quality of it, was, Kirk thought, probably the most complete answer to that question that language could not have improved upon. McCoy was quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice that had shed its habitual protective layer of irascibility and was simply, plainly, humanly honest, "My God, how long have you been doing this?" No answer. But the weight of the silence was itself a kind of answer. It was Kor's voice coming through the open channel that broke it. The Klingon commander had been listening to Spock's analysis with visible attention, and when he spoke now, his voice carried a quality that Kirk had heard from Klingons before, in the presence of genuinely extraordinary things. A controlled and a almost reluctant admiration. A warrior who fights knowing that victory brings a larger enemy, Kor said slowly, and fights anyway. He paused. That is either the purest expression of courage I have encountered, or the most profound madness. Perhaps both. Perhaps, Kirk said quietly, that distinction stops mattering after a certain point. He looked at the entity on the view screen, looked at the DoomSlayer, looked at the entity again. 37 minutes of analysis, a Klingon alliance of convenience, a dimensional horror holding 50,000 kilometers off the port bow and waiting with geological patience for an answer to an ultimatum, and a being that had been fighting a war so long and so vast that the scope of it was simply not expressible in terms the Federation had developed language for. He needed a plan. "Spock," he said, the energy that the DoomSlayer generates, the refined, concentrated version of the entity's own signature. If we could interface with the ship's deflector array, use it as a focusing mechanism, could we amplify and direct that energy in a way that would affect the entity? Spock considered this with the focused care he brought to engineering problems that were operating at the outer boundary of theoretical possibility. The deflector array is designed to project and shape energy fields, he said. If the DoomSlayer's energy output could be routed through the array's projection matrix, which would require direct physical interface between the DoomSlayer and the deflector control system, the amplification factor could be significant. He paused. The primary obstacle is that we do not know whether the DoomSlayer can modulate its energy output on demand, or whether the interface between its biology and our technology is even possible. Kirk looked at the DoomSlayer. The figure had been listening. It was always listening, always processing, always 3 analytical steps ahead of the conversation in whatever framework it used for cognition. It looked at Kirk now, with a focused attention that Kirk had learned to read as active engagement rather than passive reception. "I know this is a great deal to ask," Kirk said. "I know we haven't given you much reason to trust us yet, but if there's any way you can work with us, not for us, I'm with us. We have a better chance of dealing with that thing out there without it tearing a hole in this sector that takes out a Federation colony." He paused, and possibly without whatever's behind it, deciding to send something bigger. The DoomSlayer held his gaze for a long moment. Then it moved, purposive, direct, no wasted motion, toward the turbo lift. "Where is it going?" Chekhov asked. Kirk watched the figure move, watched the deliberate direction of its motion, the certainty of it, the quality of someone who has made a decision and is implementing it without requiring the decision to be validated by anyone else. "Spock," Kirk said, "where is the deflector control interface from here?" Spock checked his console. "Deck 10, Section 4, directly accessible from Turbo Lift 3. A brief pause. The turbo lift the DoomSlayer has just entered." Kirk was out of the command chair before Spock finished the sentence. "You have the bridge, Mr. Spock," he said, already moving. "Keep that channel with the Klothos open. Tell Kor to hold his position and be ready to move on my signal." He reached the turbolift doors as they closed behind the DoomSlayer and hit the call panel. And somebody tell Scotty we're about to do something with his deflector array that isn't in any technical manual. From the engineering station, a voice that managed to convey professional alarm, personal affront, and deeply resigned acceptance in approximately equal measure. I heard that, Captain. The turbolift doors opened. Kirk stepped in. Deck 10 of the USS Enterprise was engineering territory in the truest sense. Not the domain of the warp core itself, which occupied its own cathedral-like space further aft, but the dense functional infrastructure that supported every major system on the ship. The corridors here were narrower than the upper decks, the ceiling lower, the aesthetic stripped of the design concessions to comfort in presentation that the crew quarters and bridge enjoyed. What remained was pure utility. Conduit housings running along the walls in organized bundles, access panels set into every third meter of bulkhead, the ambient temperature 2 degrees warmer than standard due to the heat output of the systems running behind every surface. The lighting was brighter and more clinical, designed for work rather than habitation. When everything about Deck 10 communicated that this was a place where the ship did its thinking, and the humans who came here were secondary to that process. Kirk moved through it quickly, following the DoomSlayer's trajectory from the turbolift toward deflector control with the focused pace of someone who had been on enough decks of enough starships to navigate by instinct. Behind him, slightly less quickly, but with no less purpose, came Montgomery Scott, who had materialized from the direction of the main engineering section, with the particular quality of urgency that engineers reserved for situations involving their systems being subjected to procedures that were not in any technical manual. "Captain," Scotty said, "why are you falling into step beside Kirk with the brisk efficiency of a man who had a great deal to say and was rationing it carefully? I've been listening to everything from the bridge, and I want to register, formally and for the record, that what you're proposing to do with the deflector array is necessary," Kirk said. "I was going to say unprecedented, highly experimental, and potentially catastrophic for the emitter coils," Scotty said, "though necessary is also accurate." He was carrying a toolkit and had the expression of a man who had already begun designing solutions to problems that hadn't fully revealed themselves yet, which was, Kirk had always thought, the essential quality that made Scotty irreplaceable. The deflector array is designed to project and shape energy fields generated by the ship's own power systems. If we're going to route an external biological energy source through it, and I want to be clear that in 30 years of engineering, I have never had occasion to use those words in that sequence, we're going to need an interface, something that can accept the DoomSlayer's energy output and translate it into a form the deflector's projection matrix can work with. "Can you build that?" Kirk asked. "I can build anything," Scotty said, with the calm certainty of a man making a factual statement. "The question is whether I can build it in the time we have, with the components we have aboard, for a biological energy source I've never encountered before and don't yet have full specifications on." He paused. "Also, I'd like to know how we're getting the biological energy source to cooperate with the interface, i.e. given that it appears to be communicating primarily through a combination of silence and doing exactly what it wants regardless of anyone's opinion." They turned a corner and came within sight of the deflector control section entrance. A reinforced doorway with a security panel that was currently reading an anomalous entry, which confirmed that the DoomSlayer had already gone through. The door was intact. The security panel was intact. The DoomSlayer had apparently been granted access by the ship's computer, which suggested either that the computer had made a judgment call about authorized personnel that Kirk would need to review later, or that the DoomSlayer had interfaced with the security system in a way that the ship had interpreted as legitimate. Kirk made a note to ask Spock about that later and moved through the door. The deflector control was a large, circular space dominated by the primary interface console at its center. A horseshoe-shaped bank of controls and displays that managed the projection and modulation of the Enterprise's main deflector dish, the forward-facing energy projector that served as the ship's primary protection against spatial debris at warp speeds, and was capable of being repurposed, under specific circumstances, for a range of other energy projection tasks. The console faced a large transparent panel that looked directly onto the deflector dish assembly, a complex, layered structure of emitter coils and field projectors that sat at the bow of the ship like the focused eye of some mechanical organism, currently configured for standard navigational deflection. The DoomSlayer was standing at the center of the room. It was not at the console. It was not examining the deflector assembly through the transparent panel. It was standing in the precise center of the circular space with its arms slightly away from its body and its attention directed not at any specific point in the room but inward. A posture that Kirk had no prior reference for, but that registered in the way that clear and unambiguous physical communication always registered regardless of species, as preparation. It was doing something, not yet, but it was making itself ready to do something in the particular way that a person makes themselves ready before attempting a physical task that requires full commitment, centering, focusing, drawing on whatever internal resources the task demands. Scotty stopped beside Kirk and looked at the figure for a moment with the expression of an engineer encountering a component he doesn't have specifications for. "Right," he said quietly. "So, what exactly does it intend to do?" "I think," Kirk said equally quietly, "it intends to show us." He walked to the primary interface console and pulled up the deflector system's current status. All readings nominal, energy output steady at navigational deflection parameters, emitter coils running at 30% capacity. He looked at the readings, then at the DoomSlayer, then at the transparent panel and the deflector assembly beyond it. "Scotty," he said, "if we open the deflector's energy intake manifold, the secondary port, the one designed for external power supplementation, what happens to the projection matrix?" Scotty moved to the console, reading the same displays with the speed of someone who had memorized the system architecture well enough to navigate it without looking. "The projection matrix defaults to pass-through mode," he said. "Whatever energy comes in through the intake port gets shaped by the field coils and projected outward through the emitter array. Normally, that's used for emergency power supplementation from a secondary generator. It's designed to work with standard electromagnetic energy inputs." He paused. "It is emphatically not designed to work with—" He gestured toward the DoomSlayer. "Hey, whatever that is." "But the matrix would attempt to shape and project whatever came in," Kirk said. "Aye, it's not capable of refusing. The intake port accepts in the matrix projects. That's what it does." Scotty looked at the DoomSlayer again with the expression of a man performing a rapid engineering assessment on something that was not, strictly speaking, an engineering component. "The question is, what happens to the field coils when they try to process an energy type they weren't designed for? Best case, they adapt and we get a functional projection. Worst case, how bad is worst case? Emitter coil burnout, field matrix collapse, and approximately 72 hours of emergency deflector repairs while we navigate at impulse with no forward deflection," Scotty said, "which would be a significant tactical liability given that we're currently sitting between a dimensional horror entity and a Klingon battlecruiser." "Noted," Kirk said. "Meyer opened the intake port." Scotty looked at him for exactly 1 second with the expression he reserved for orders he found professionally objectionable but recognized as commands rather than suggestions. Then he turned to the console and began entering the access sequence for the secondary intake port. "Opening external energy intake," he said, with the precision of an engineer narrating his own actions as a record. "Field coils shifting to pass-through configuration. Projection matrix standing by." He stepped back from the console. "Port is open, Captain. Whatever goes in comes out through the emitter array." Kirk walked to the center of the room and stood facing the DoomSlayer at a distance of approximately 3 meters. He looked at the figure, at the deliberate preparatory posture, once at the internal focus that was radiating from it in the way that extreme concentration radiated from any being capable of it, at the quality of readiness that had been building since they entered the room. "The deflector is ready," he said. "Whatever you can give it, whatever you have that affects that entity, the ship will project it. I can't promise it'll work exactly the way you'd expect. Our systems weren't built for this." He paused. "But they're built well, and so are the people who maintain them." He stepped back to give the figure space. The DoomSlayer looked at him for a moment, then it looked at the transparent panel, through it at the deflector assembly. Then it closed its gauntleted hands into fists, a slow, deliberate motion, and something happened in the room. It was not visible, not at first. While it was felt, in the same way that the entity's transmissions had been felt, as a pressure and a vibration below the threshold of standard perception, except that this was different in its fundamental character. where the entity's energy had felt like the pressure of something vast and cold pressing inward. This felt like the opposite, like heat without temperature, like force without mass, like the specific, focused intensity of a will that had been reduced over decades or centuries of sustained extremity to its single, essential, irreducible element, the refusal. The absolute, implacable, non-negotiable refusal to yield to the thing it opposed. The DoomSlayer's armor began to change. Not structurally. The physical composition of the armor remained unchanged. No panels opening, no components extending. But the surface of it was doing something that Kirk had no reference for. A luminescence that was not quite light, emanating from within the material itself, the same way that certain bioluminescent deep-sea organisms generated light from their own biochemistry rather than reflecting it from an external source. The color was difficult to name. Green in some aspects, gold in others, carrying both without being quite either, in the way that things carried colors that existed outside the spectrum human eyes were designed to process. The ambient temperature in the room rose 4 degrees in 11 seconds. Scotty, watching his console, made a sound that was not quite a word, but communicated that the readings he was seeing were not readings he had previously encountered. "Captain," he said carefully. The intake port. It's receiving something. The field coils are..." He stopped, read the display again with the focused attention of someone who has learned not to trust a reading until he has confirmed it twice. "They're adapting. I've never seen the field coils do this. They're restructuring their alignment in response to the energy input. The matrix is..." Another pause, longer. "The matrix is accepting it. I don't know how. The energy type shouldn't be compatible with the coil architecture, but it's accepting it." "What's coming out through the emitter array?" Kirk asked. Scotty checked the forward sensor data that the ship's internal systems were capturing from the deflector dish itself. His expression underwent a sequence of rapid changes. Technical assessment, recalibration, something approaching genuine awe that he managed to keep professional by a visible act of will. "Something is coming out," he said, "a projected energy field using the deflector's standard projection geometry. But the energy composition..." He shook his head slowly. "Captain, this is not any energy type in the Federation database. The field coils have translated it into something the emitter array can project. But what they've produced it's a hybrid. The DoomSlayer's energy, filtered through Federation deflector technology, projected at starship scale." He looked up. "I have no way of predicting what it does to the entity. I don't have a theoretical framework for it." "Spock might," Kirk said. He tapped his communicator. "Kirk to bridge." "Spock here, Captain. We have energy output through the deflector array." "Hey, what are you reading?" A pause. The specific quality of pause that meant Spock was looking at something that required more than a moment to process accurately. "Confirmed, Captain. The deflector array is projecting an energy field of remarkable composition. It is..." Another brief pause. "Extraordinary. The field carries the same fundamental signature as the DoomSlayer's biological energy output, but amplified by a factor of approximately 40 through the deflector's projection matrix and shaped by the field geometry into a coherent, directed beam." Another pause. "Captain, the entity is responding." "How?" "It is moving," Spock said. "Not toward us. Away. The energy field from the deflector array appears to be repelling it. The entity is withdrawing at a rate significantly faster than its previous approach velocity." A pause. "This is consistent with the hypothesis that the DoomSlayer's energy is antithetical to the entity in some fundamental way. At deflector-amplified scale, the effect is apparently sufficient to overcome the entity's dimensional anchoring in local space." Kirk exhaled, looked at the DoomSlayer, which was maintaining its focused posture with the complete commitment of something putting every available resource into a single sustained effort. The luminescence of the armor was steady, not flickering, but the quality of the effort behind it was visible even to someone who couldn't measure it. In the absolute stillness of the figure, the total absence of any energy expenditure that wasn't directed toward the single objective. "Spock," Kirk said, "how far is it retreating?" 70,000 kilometers, Spock said. 80. When it has exceeded the range at which its transmission would reach us with the intensity of its initial communication. A pause. 100,000 kilometers. Its velocity of retreat is still increasing. Is it going back through the breach? Unknown. The breach itself, the dimensional tear through which both the DoomSlayer and the entity entered our space, has partially closed since the initial crossing. Whether the entity can reopen it from this side, and whether it will attempt to do so, I cannot currently determine. Another pause. Captain, I am also reading a significant response from the Klothos. What kind of response? Commander Kor has powered up his weapon systems, Spock said. All disruptors and torpedo launchers. He appears to be preparing to fire on the retreating entity. Kirk closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Of course he is. He tapped the communicator again. Kirk to bridge. Open the channel to the Klothos. Channel open, Captain. Uhura's voice. Kor. Kirk kept his voice level and clear. Hold your fire. A pause from the Klingon end. When Kor spoke, his voice carried the specific quality of a warrior who has identified a target and is being asked to lower his weapon, and is doing the internal calculus of whether the request has merit. It is retreating, Kirk. Now is the optimal moment to strike. If we disable it before it can return through the dimensional breach, if you fire on it now, you might drive it back through the breach, Kirk said. Or you might wound it enough that it decides retreat is no longer the better option and reverses course. We don't know enough about how it makes tactical decisions to risk that. He paused. Let it go. Let it carry the message back, that what it was sent to retrieve is not available, that the retrieval failed. Another pause. Kor. A wounded enemy with nothing to lose is not a victory. It's a complication. A longer pause from the Klothos. Hold fire, Kor said. The words were directed at his weapons officer, not at Kirk, but the channel was open, and Kirk heard them clearly. Then to Kirk directly. You have an aggravating habit of being right about things I would prefer to solve with disruptors. I've been told that before, Kirk said. In the center of the deflector control room, something changed, and the luminescence of the DoomSlayer's armor shifted, not extinguishing, but reducing, the way a fire settles when its immediate fuel demand decreases. The quality of the focused effort behind it changed from full commitment to something more sustainable, a managed output rather than a maximum one. The temperature in the room began to drop back toward standard. The DoomSlayer lowered its arms, slowly, with the controlled, deliberate movement of something that was managing the transition from maximum exertion back to baseline with the practiced efficiency of long experience. Scotty was watching his console. Energy through the intake port is reducing, he said quietly. Field coils are stepping down. Deflector array returning toward standard configuration. He read the next display. Where the entity is at 300,000 kilometers and still retreating. He looked up at Kirk. Captain, the emitter coils they're intact, all of them. Now, I don't understand how. The energy type that went through them should have... He stopped, shook his head slowly. The field coils restructured their molecular alignment during the interface. They're not the same coils they were 20 minutes ago. Whatever the DoomSlayer's energy did to them, they've been changed. I don't know what they are now. Are they functional? Kirk asked. Scotty ran the diagnostic. He said, with the expression of someone deeply unsettled by a piece of engineering that has done something he didn't design it to do. More than functional. The alignment they've settled into is... He studied the readings. Sure, it's more efficient than the factory configuration by about 12%. Kirk looked at the DoomSlayer. The figure had completed its transition back to baseline and was standing with its customary stillness, its attention distributed once more across the room in the comprehensive monitoring posture that Kirk had learned to read as its default state. The luminescence was gone from the armor. It looked exactly as it had when Kirk first saw it on the internal feed from the bridge. Scarred, massive, ancient, carrying the accumulated record of everything it had survived. Except that Kirk was reading it differently now. He had watched it stand in the center of a room on a starship it had no reason to trust and interface its own fundamental energy with the ship's systems in the service of a threat that, ultimately, was his crew's problem as much as its own. He had watched it do this without negotiation, without hesitation, without requiring anything from them beyond the straightforward preparation of the deflector intake port. He had watched it fight in its way. Quietly, technically, in collaboration with people it had met less than 2 hours ago. Without being asked in terms it could verbally confirm, without making it a transaction. Spock, he said into the communicator. Current position of the entity? 480,000 kilometers and still retreating, Spock said. It has not altered course. At current velocity, it will reach the coordinates of the original dimensional breach in approximately 14 minutes. A pause. Captain? And I am detecting energy fluctuations at those coordinates, consistent with the breach beginning to reopen from the entity's side. It appears to be preparing to return through the dimensional boundary. Let it go, Kirk said. He looked at the DoomSlayer one more time. At the stillness of it, at the quality of attention it had returned to. Comprehensive, monitoring, present. Scotty, he said. Captain? What you said about the field coils being changed. He paused. The new alignment. Is it stable? Scotty ran another diagnostic, quick and thorough. Aye, he said. Completely stable. It's as if the coils decided this was how they were supposed to be. He looked up. Whatever that energy did to them, it didn't damage them. It improved them. Permanently by the look of it. Kirk nodded slowly. He thought about that. How about a being that had spent what might be centuries fighting something vast and dark and implacable, and had developed in the process an energy that didn't just oppose that darkness, but when it passed through things, left them better than it found them. He thought that was probably worth noting. Good, he said quietly. He tapped his communicator. Kirk to bridge. Stand down from battle stations. Maintain yellow alert. He paused. And tell Kor to meet us in Transporter Room 2 in 20 minutes. He said he wanted to meet our guest face to face. He looked at the DoomSlayer. I think it's time we properly introduced you to a Klingon. Transporter Room 2 on the USS Enterprise was not by design a room intended for diplomatic encounters. It was a functional space, clean, efficiently arranged, dominated by the 6-pad transporter platform at its rear and the operator's console at its front, with enough floor space between them to accommodate a standard away team assembly without crowding. It had hosted countless departures and arrivals in its service life, beamed personnel and equipment to planetary surfaces and other vessels in spatial coordinates that ranged from the routine to the genuinely extraordinary. And it had done so with the quiet, reliable competence of a system that was simply very good at its job and had never been asked to be anything more than that. Today it was being asked to be something more than that. Kirk had made the choice of venue deliberately. The transporter room had a quality of neutrality that the bridge did not. The bridge was Kirk's domain, his command center, every element of it calibrated to reinforce the authority and perspective of the captain. Bringing Kor there would have established a hierarchy that a Klingon commander would find difficult to operate within comfortably. The transporter room, by contrast, was functional and unadorned and carried no particular symbolic weight. It was a room where things arrived and departed. It was, in its way, a threshold, and thresholds had a cultural resonance across enough species that Kirk trusted it to carry the right quality of neutrality for what he intended. He was standing near the operator's console when the transporter engaged, the familiar shimmer of materialization building on the platform with the rising harmonic that Kirk had heard thousands of times and never quite stopped finding remarkable. Light resolved into solidity. The harmonic faded. Commander Kor of the Klingon Empire materialized on the transporter platform with the contained, deliberate physicality of a man who had been in enough situations where his bearing communicated critical information to have made the management of his bearing into an art form. He stepped down from the platform without pause, the single step from platform to floor executed with the unconscious authority of someone for whom hesitation was a foreign concept, and stopped. He was looking at the DoomSlayer. The DoomSlayer was standing to Kirk's left, positioned with its characteristic spatial awareness near the bulkhead where it had the clearest sightlines to both the door and the transporter platform. It was watching Kor with the comprehensive, systematic attention it directed at everything new. Building its assessment with the rapid efficiency that Kirk had come to recognize as one of its most fundamental and continuous activities. Kor looked back. The quality of that mutual regard. Two beings whose entire existence had been shaped by combat and survival, and the sustained encounter with things that wanted to destroy them. Looking at each other across the functional interior of a Starfleet transporter room had a weight to it that Kirk felt without being able to fully articulate. It was the weight of recognition, not personal recognition. They had never met. Something more fundamental. The recognition of shared essence. of two things that had been defined by the same crucible, however different the specific fires. Kor descended the final step from the platform and walked to the center of the room. He stopped at a distance from the DoomSlayer that was close enough to communicate directness and far enough to communicate respect. The specific interpersonal geometry of a warrior culture that had precise, unspoken rules about proximity and what it signified. He clasped his hands behind his back, stood straight, and looked at the DoomSlayer with an expression that had shed the tactical calculation of the view screen exchange and replaced it with something simpler and more direct. He was looking at a warrior. He was looking at it the way Klingon warriors looked at things they genuinely respected, which was differently from the way they looked at things they feared or coveted or planned to destroy. The distinction was not subtle once you knew the culture well enough to read it. "You drove it back," Kor said. His voice was quieter than it had been on the view screen. The specific quality of quiet that indicated a Klingon was speaking for an audience of one rather than performing for a crew. "The entity, you stood in the center of the ship and you drove it back." He paused. "Our sensors recorded the energy output from the deflector array. I have spent 30 years studying weapons technology, and what came from that array was not technology." He paused again, and when he spoke next, the word carried its full Klingon weight, unironic and unqualified. It was will. The DoomSlayer held his gaze, said nothing, but the quality of its attention toward Kor had shifted in the subtle but readable way that Kirk was developing fluency in. It had recognized something in the Klingon commander's framing that it found accurate. Kor turned to Kirk briefly. "Don't you understand what I mean?" he said. It was not a question. "I think so," Kirk said. "A weapon projects force," Kor said, turning back to the DoomSlayer. "A warrior projects will. Force can be countered. Will," he paused. "Will is more difficult." He studied the figure for another long moment. "How long?" he asked. The question was simple and direct in the manner of Klingon directness, which stripped away the social scaffolding that other cultures build around difficult questions. "How long have you fought it? The thing that follows you, the darkness behind the darkness." No verbal answer. The DoomSlayer looked at him steadily for a moment, then made the same gesture it had made in sickbay when Kirk had asked a related question. That slow, deliberate downward movement of the hand. Below, beneath, a very long time beneath. Kor watched the gesture, absorbed it. "Long enough that the counting stopped mattering," he said. It was not quite a question. The quality of the DoomSlayer's stillness answered it. Kor was quiet for a moment. "I came here," he said finally, "with orders to acquire you, to bring you before the High Council as a strategic asset of the Klingon Empire." He said it with the directness of someone making a confession that costs him nothing because the intention it describes has already been abandoned. "I want you to know that, because I think you already know it, and because honesty between warriors is more respectful than the pretense of motives we don't have." He paused. "I am not going to attempt to acquire you, not because I lack the means to try." He glanced at Kirk with a brief, sharp expression that managed to be simultaneously respectful and competitive. "But because what I saw from the Klothos's bridge when you drove that entity back told me that the concept of acquisition does not apply to you. You are not a thing that is owned or directed. You are a thing that chooses its battles." He paused. When he spoke again, his voice carried the specific register of a Klingon warrior making a declaration that his culture treated with absolute seriousness. "I would ask instead to know your name, warrior to warrior, not for the High Council's records, not for strategic intelligence, because you have earned that courtesy and I would give it." The transporter room was very quiet. Kirk had been listening to this exchange with the focused attention he brought to diplomatic situations that were operating outside conventional frameworks, situations where the rules of engagement were being written in real time by the participants, and where the wrong move could unravel something that was working. He had said nothing since Kor's arrival, understanding instinctively that this particular moment required him to be present, but not central. This was not his exchange. It was happening between the Klingon and the figure that stood beside him, and it was happening in a register that his presence could support but not improve. The DoomSlayer looked at Kor for a long moment. Then it reached up to its helmet. Both Kirk and Kor went very still. And not from fear, or not only from fear, but from the specific quality of attention that very significant moments demanded. The helmet seals disengaged with a series of soft, sequential clicks, each one precise and mechanical, and carrying more weight than mechanical sounds usually carried. The helmet came free. What was revealed was a face that was human or human-derived, carrying the fundamental architecture of human features in a way that placed it within recognizable parameters, while simultaneously placing it at a significant remove from any specific human that Kirk had encountered. The face was weathered in the way that faces were weathered by sustained extreme exposure. Not aged exactly, but marked, the skin carrying the accumulated record of conditions that most human faces never encountered. The eyes were the element that most resisted easy categorization. They were a color that fell within the blue-green range but carried a quality in their expression, in the depth and stillness and absolute implacable focus of them, that did not correspond to any specific age or experience level Kirk could point to. They were eyes that had looked at things long enough that looking had become its own kind of action rather than a passive reception of the world. Kor looked at the face with the same comprehensive, respectful assessment he had directed at the armor. His expression, in the specific way that Klingon expressions changed, shifted. "You are human," he said, with something in his voice that was not quite surprise. Klingon commanders did not do surprise, but was the recalibration of an assessment that had been running on incomplete data. The DoomSlayer said nothing, but something in the set of the face, in the quality of its stillness, confirmed it. "A human," Kor said slowly, "who has fought what follows you, for as long as you have fought it." He paused. "The Klingon Empire has a word. Painstick." He paused. "No, that is not the right word. We have another word. Older. Dahar Master. A warrior who has achieved a state of combat that transcends technical skill and becomes something metaphysical. Something the body does because the will has remade the body in its own image." He studied the DoomSlayer's face with the focused, why genuine attention of a man encountering something he finds both extraordinary and, in some deep cultural sense, comprehensible. "We do not use that word lightly. We do not use it for humans." Another pause. "I would use it for you." McCoy, who had been standing near the door of the transporter room in the manner of a man who had told himself he was only there for medical observation and had gradually become simply riveted, made a quiet sound. Kirk glanced at him. The doctor's expression was doing several things simultaneously. The professional assessment that never entirely switched off, overlaid with something more personal and harder to name. The expression of a man looking at another human being who had become something he doesn't have a category for, and feeling in that gap the full complexity of what that means. "Aye, bones," Kirk said quietly. "I'm fine," McCoy said. He stopped. "I'm fine." Kor took one step forward. He reached out his right hand, a gesture that was not Federation handshake and not Klingon formal salute, but something older and more elemental, the simple, direct extension of an open hand between one warrior and another. "Commander Kor of the House of Kor," he said, "in the service of the Klingon Empire, and today, in the service of something more important than the Empire." A pause. "It is an honor to stand in the same room as you." The DoomSlayer looked at the extended hand, looked at Kor's face. Then with the deliberate, controlled motion that characterized everything it did, it reached out and clasped the hand. And not the Federation handshake, something more like the grip that two people exchanged when they needed to hold each other up, palm to palm, fingers closing with the pressure of recognition. Kor's grip tightened. He looked the DoomSlayer directly in the eyes. "Whatever comes next," he said, "know that the Klingon Empire has seen what you are, and will remember it." The grip held for 3 seconds, then both released simultaneously, with the mutual ease of beings who had been doing exactly what they meant to do and were finished. Kirk let a moment pass. Then, "Commander Kor, we need to talk about what comes next." Kor turned to him, shifting back into the register of command with the smooth transition of a man who had been doing both things simultaneously all along. "The entity retreated," he said. "It did not return through the breach immediately. Our sensors show it holding at approximately 800,000 kilometers. Waiting, Kirk said, "which is what concerns me." "It will send for reinforcements," Kor said. The assessment was flat and direct, the tactical analysis of a man who had been in enough military situations to recognize a strategic pause when he saw one. Whatever sent it here, if it receives the report that retrieval failed, that the target is being protected by Federation and Klingon forces using the target's own energy amplified through Starfleet technology. It will not simply abandon the objective, it will escalate. Spock said the same thing, Kirk said. Something larger. Something larger, Kor confirmed, which means we have a window, a limited one. He looked at the DoomSlayer. Pulling on it, and the only asset we have that can actually affect that entity, and whatever comes after it, is standing in this room. Kirk looked at the DoomSlayer. The figure had replaced its helmet during the last exchange. The seals re-engaging with the same sequential precision as their disengagement. The face disappearing back behind the visor. The totality of its physical presence reassembling itself into the armored, contained, implacable form that the crew of the Enterprise had been navigating around for the past several hours. Kirk felt the loss of the face, the strange intimacy of having seen it and now not seeing it, but understood the rearming for what it was. It was not concealment. It was preparation. The DoomSlayer was thinking about what came next. And what it was thinking about what came next was readable in every line of its posture. It was thinking about going through the breach. Kirk had been thinking about the same thing for the last 40 minutes, with the particular quality of attention he directed at plans that were simultaneously necessary and genuinely terrible. The logic was sound, as terrible plans often were. The entity had retreated through, or toward, the dimensional breach. The force behind it, whatever it was, existed on the other side of that breach. If it was going to send something larger, it would come through that breach, which meant the breach was the critical point, the choke point through which any escalation had to pass. And the one thing that had demonstrably been able to affect the entity, to drive it back at ranges and speeds that their conventional weapons could not have achieved, was the DoomSlayer's energy, amplified through the deflector array. "You want to go through," Kirk said, not an accusation, a recognition. The DoomSlayer's attention, comprehensive and complete, settled on him. "You want to take the fight to the source," Kirk continued, "before it can send something larger, before whatever is behind that entity can organize a second retrieval attempt at scale." He paused. "And you think that if you go through the breach, you can do enough damage on the other side to buy time, or more than time?" The quality of the DoomSlayer's stillness was itself an answer. "Shui, the breach is closing," Spock's voice came through the communicator. He had been monitoring from the bridge and had apparently been following the conversation through the open channel. "At current rate of closure, it will be impassable within approximately 4 hours. If the DoomSlayer intends to cross through, the window is finite." Kor looked at Kirk. "If it goes through alone," "I know," Kirk said. "The odds of—" "I know, Kor." He looked at the DoomSlayer. "I'm not going to tell you not to go," he said. "You've been making this call longer than any of us have been alive, and you don't need my permission or my advice." He paused. "What I want to know is whether there's anything we can do from this side. Whether the deflector array, whether having an amplification point on this side of the breach, changes what's possible for you on the other side." The DoomSlayer was still for a long moment. Then it moved to the transporter console. Not with aggression, with purpose. It stood before the console and looked at it with the comprehensive assessment it brought to all technology, reading it with the intuitive speed of something that had interfaced with a great many systems across a great many contexts and had developed the ability to understand functional architecture at a glance. Then it looked at Kirk and made a gesture, one hand pointing at the console, the other pointing at itself. A clear, unambiguous, direct communication. "Show me how this works." Kirk looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Scotty, who had followed them from deflector control and was standing near the door with his toolkit and his expression of resigned, brilliant preparedness. "Scotty," Kirk said, "our guest wants to understand the transporter." Scotty looked at the DoomSlayer, looked at the console, looked back at Kirk with the expression of a man who had heard a sentence that contained entirely normal words arranged in a sequence that nonetheless managed to describe something unprecedented. "Right," he said. He walked to the console. "Well, let's start with the basics." The next 3 hours on the USS Enterprise had the quality of time that compressed itself under pressure, each minute carrying the weight of several. or the ship's systems running at a sustained intensity that hummed through every deck with the particular vibration of a vessel operating at the edge of its design parameters and being asked by the people who knew it best to go a little further. Scotty had not slept. This was not unusual for Scotty in a crisis. He operated on a personal energy economy that seemed to draw from sources his medical file didn't fully account for, sustaining periods of intense technical work on what appeared to be equal parts engineering passion and the specific Scottish stubbornness that Kirk had long since stopped trying to model rationally and had simply learned to rely on. He had been at the deflector control console, at the transporter console, and at 3 separate junction points in the EPS conduit network connecting the 2 systems, one often in rapid succession, building something that had no precedent in Starfleet engineering manuals because it had never existed before and would likely never need to exist again. What he was building was an interface, not the relatively simple energy intake modification he had implemented during the initial engagement with the entity. That had been an improvisation, a routing of the DoomSlayer's energy output through an existing system that happened to be compatible enough to function. What he was building now was more deliberate and more complex. A purpose-designed conduit between the transporter's pattern buffer and the deflector's projection matrix, and with a modification to the buffer's operating parameters that would allow it to hold and stabilize the DoomSlayer's energy signature in a way that could be projected through the deflector at controlled intervals and intensities. The idea had emerged from 3 hours of conversation between Scotty, Spock, and the DoomSlayer, conducted in the hybrid language of technical demonstration, sensor readings, and the DoomSlayer's systematic, intuitive engagement with every piece of technology Scotty showed it. The figure had moved through the technical briefings with the focused efficiency of something that processed new technical information, not by memorizing it, but by integrating it, adding it to an existing framework of understanding that was broader and more sophisticated than any of them had initially assumed. It had, over the course of those 3 hours, communicated something that Spock had eventually been able to articulate clearly after watching the pattern of the DoomSlayer's interactions with the ship's systems. The DoomSlayer was not simply a biological organism that happened to generate unusual energy. It was, in some deep and fundamental sense, an energy system that had organized itself around a biological core. The energy was not something it produced. It was something it was. The armor, the weapons, the biological modifications that McCoy's scans had detected. All of it was infrastructure, support systems for the energy at the center of it, the way a power plant's physical structure was infrastructure for the reaction it contained. What this meant practically was that the DoomSlayer could modulate its energy output with a precision that went significantly beyond what any of them had initially assumed. It was not simply generating energy and allowing it to flow outward. It was managing it, directing it, shaping it, varying its intensity and character with the deliberate control of something that had spent a very long time learning exactly what its energy could do and how to make it do it. The plan that emerged from this understanding was, in Spock's assessment, theoretically sound, practically unprecedented, and carrying a margin of risk that he expressed in numerical terms that Kirk had listened to and then deliberately not repeated to the rest of the crew. The breach was the key. It had not fully closed. 4 hours after the entity's retreat, it remained open at approximately 40% of its original diameter, still passable but narrowing at a measurable rate. The entity itself had not returned through it. It was still holding at 800,000 kilometers, still patient, still waiting in the way that things waited when they had resources the other side did not, and time was on their side. The plan addressed both problems simultaneously. From the ship's side of the breach, the deflector array, with Scotty's interface modifications and the DoomSlayer's energy routed through the pattern buffer as a stored and controllable source, would project a sustained energy field through the breach into whatever lay beyond it. Not a single burst as in the initial engagement, but a sustained, each shape projection designed to do maximum damage to the dimensional infrastructure on the other side, to destabilize the energy system from which the entity and whatever backed it drew their power, at the point where that system interfaced with the breach. From beyond the breach, the DoomSlayer would do what the DoomSlayer did. The logic was the logic of combined arms, pressure from two directions simultaneously, each amplifying the effect of the other, Neither alone sufficient, but both together potentially adequate. Potentially. The margin that Spock had expressed in numbers, Kirk wasn't repeating. It was, Kirk had told himself in the quiet of his captain's quarters, during the 40 minutes he had spent there between the planning session and the execution, the best plan available. Not a good plan in any absolute sense. A best available plan. There was a difference, and he had learned over the course of his career to be honest with himself about which category he was operating in. He was on the bridge when the final preparations were completed. Spock at the science station, running continuous analysis of the breach in the entity's position. Sulu at the helm, the Enterprise positioned with the deflector array oriented toward the breach at optimal projection angle. Chekhov at navigation, tracking the entity's position with the focused attention of someone who understood that the moment the entity changed its behavior, the timeline of everything changed with it. Uhura monitoring every frequency, every modulation, every signal type she had cataloged from the entity since its arrival. The DoomSlayer was in deflector control. It had gone there 20 minutes ago with Scotty to complete the interface connection and confirm that the energy routing through the pattern buffer was holding stable. Scotty had come back to the bridge 10 minutes after that with the expression of a man who had just watched something he didn't have adequate language for and was processing it at the speed his engineering mind allowed. "It's ready, Captain," Scotty said. "The interface is holding. The pattern buffer has..." He paused. "It's changed. The way the field coils changed. The buffer's matrix has adapted to the energy signature being stored in it. It's more stable than it should be. More coherent." He paused again. "The DoomSlayer has been... It's been working with the buffer, modulating the stored energy in ways I wouldn't have thought to try. The projection potential is..." He shook his head slightly. "It's significantly higher than my initial calculations suggested." "How much higher?" Kirk asked. "Enough that I've had to recalculate the effect radius 3 times, Scotty said. "The energy projection through the deflector array, at the intensity the buffer is now capable of producing, it won't just push through the breach. It'll propagate into whatever's on the other side along the dimensional fault lines that the breach is sitting on. Like..." He searched for the analogy. "Like a charge placed at a structural weak point. The energy follows the weakness and amplifies its effect far beyond what a direct projection would achieve." "Spock," Kirk said. "Mr. Scott's assessment is consistent with my own revised calculations," Spock said. "Huckleberry, the dimensional fault lines along which the breach has formed represent a structural vulnerability in the boundary between our universe and the dimension from which the entity originates. A sufficiently powerful and specifically tuned energy projection along those fault lines could, in principle, destabilize the dimensional infrastructure on the other side to a degree that would significantly impair the ability of whatever power exists there to mount further incursions into our space." "For how long?" Kirk asked. Spock considered this with appropriate precision. "Unknown. The variables involved in dimensional stability calculations at this scale are beyond our current theoretical framework. The effect could be temporary, so hours, days, or it could be significantly more permanent. Why, depending on the structural integrity of the dimensional boundary once the fault lines are destabilized." He paused. "What I can say with confidence is that the combined effect of the deflector projection and the DoomSlayer's direct engagement on the other side of the breach represents the most significant potential damage to the entity's power base that our analysis has identified." "And the DoomSlayer," Kirk said, "on the other side of the breach, what are its chances?" Spock was quiet for a moment. The particular quality of that quiet, the specific texture of a pause from someone who was not avoiding the question, but was selecting the most honest possible answer with the care that honesty sometimes required, told Kirk what the numbers were before Spock spoke them. The dimensional environment beyond the breach is unknown," Spock said carefully. "The entity operates there at full capacity. The DoomSlayer in that environment would be facing conditions that may affect its energy output and physical capabilities in ways we cannot currently predict. If the dimensional physics on the other side are significantly different from our own, and the evidence suggests they are, the DoomSlayer's abilities may function at reduced efficiency during the initial period of adaptation." He paused. "However, every previous indication we have suggests that this being's fundamental characteristic is the capacity to adapt, to take what its environment provides, and to find within that environment the means to continue. Whatever the odds of survival in standard terms, they do not account for a variable that does not appear in standard calculations." What variable? Sulu asked from the helm, in the voice of someone listening carefully. The variable, Spock said, of a being that has been doing this for long enough that survival in impossible conditions is no longer an achievement. It is simply what it does. The bridge absorbed that. Kirk tapped his communicator. Kirk to deflector control, Scotty's voice came back. Deflector control. The DoomSlayer is ready, Captain. The interface is stable. Buffer is at full charge. A pause, and in the pause, Kirk could hear the ambient sounds of deflector control. The hum of the modified field coils, the subtle change in the ship's energy signature that the fully charged pattern buffer produced. Whenever you give the word, Kirk looked at the view screen. The breach was visible now on the main display. Spock had routed the sensor data through the visual processing system in a way that rendered it as a tear in the fabric of space, dark at its edges and lit from within by a light that was not light, that existed as the visual analog of something that didn't have a visual analog and was doing its best with the available spectrum. It was smaller than it had been, narrowing. The entity was still at 800,000 kilometers, still waiting. Uhura, Kirk said. Open a channel to the Klothos. Channel open, Captain. Kor, Kirk said. We're going in 30 seconds. The moment the deflector fires, the entity is going to respond. It's going to move toward the breach to try to prevent what we're doing. He paused. I need you to keep it occupied. A brief pause from the Klingon end. When Kor spoke, his voice had the quality of a Klingon warrior who has just been given a role he finds fundamentally compatible with his nature. You want us to engage the entity directly, he said, with weapons that may be largely ineffective against it. I want you to make it pay enough attention to the Klothos that it doesn't fully commit to stopping the deflector projection, Kirk said. You don't have to destroy it. You have to make it work for it. Another pause. Kirk, Kor said, that is either the most insulting assignment you could give a Klingon commander or the most honest one. A beat. We will make it work for it. The channel carried briefly the sound of Klingon battle stations being called. Kopla, Kirk? Kopla, Kirk said. He looked at Spock. Begin breach approach. Bring us to optimal deflector range. Aye. Captain, Sulu said, his hands moving on the helm with the practiced ease of a pilot who had been waiting for something to do and was grateful for the order. The Enterprise moved. At 800,000 kilometers, the entity responded to the ship's movement with the immediacy of something that had been monitoring them continuously and had its responses already prepared. The energy buildup that Spock had detected before the initial engagement returned. Faster this time, less measured, carrying the quality of something that recognized the situation and was not interested in the preliminary stages. It began to move toward them at a velocity that covered the first 100,000 kilometers in seconds. The Klothos is engaging, Chekhov reported, his voice carefully controlled. Disruptors and photon torpedoes firing on the entity. With the entity is... A pause. It is responding to the Klothos. Partially. It's splitting its attention between the Klothos and our approach. Partially, McCoy said, from his position near the command area. That's a loaded word, Mr. Chekhov. The entity is large enough to do both, Chekhov said, with the specific honesty of a navigator reporting what his sensors showed regardless of whether the report was welcome. Deflector range in 20 seconds, Sulu said. Kirk leaned forward in the command chair. Scotty, the moment we hit deflector range, I want full power to the array, everything the buffer has. Standing by, Captain. 15 seconds, Sulu said. The entity was at 400,000 kilometers and accelerating. On the secondary display, the Klothos was visible, the distinctive Klingon profile lit by the discharge of its own weapons, disruptor fire splashing across the entity's surface in bursts that produced visible energy reactions without producing visible damage. But the fire was drawing attention. The entity's advance toward the Enterprise was less clean than it would have been without the Klothos, interrupted by the need to direct energy toward deflecting the Klingon weapons, forced to divide its focus in a way that slowed its response time by a measurable fraction. It wasn't much, but in the mathematics of the next 10 seconds, it was enough. Deflector range, Sulu said. Fire, Kirk said. The Enterprise shuddered, not from impact, from output. The deflector array released the accumulated energy of the modified pattern buffer in a projection that the ship's own systems registered as the highest intensity deflector output in the Enterprise's service history, by a margin that Scotty would later describe as frankly alarming. The beam, if beam was the right word for something that was partly energy, partly intent, partly the distilled and amplified essence of a will that had been honed against the darkest things in dimensional space for longer than the Federation had existed, struck the breach and went through it. On the sensors, what happened on the other side of the breach was partially visible and partially inference. The dimensional fault lines that Spock had identified lit up in 17 simultaneous wavelength bands as the energy propagated along them. Finding the structural weaknesses in the dimensional boundary and flowing into them the way water found the cracks in stone. The breach itself widened briefly, a paradoxical expansion caused by the energy pressure, and then began to contract more rapidly, the fault line destabilization accelerating the closure process. And through the briefly widened breach, the DoomSlayer went. Kirk watched it on the internal sensor feed that Scotty had rigged to track the DoomSlayer's energy signature. A small display inset into the main view screen, showing the signature moving through the breach with the direct, undeviating trajectory of something that had passed through barriers before and had reduced the process to its essentials. No hesitation at the threshold. No pause. In the way a person walked through a door they had walked through many times and had no uncertainty about. The breach contracted behind it. Not closed, not yet, but narrowed to a fraction of its previous diameter. The fault line destabilization accelerating the closure rate. The entity, at 300,000 kilometers, registered the breach contraction with an energy response that Spock classified as the dimensional equivalent of alarm. It accelerated toward the breach with a sudden commitment of velocity that made its previous approach speed look measured, its full attention now pulled away from the Klothos and directed at the closing tear in dimensional space. "It's going for the breach," Chekhov said. "Keep firing," Kirk said. "Scotty, do we have anything left in the buffer?" "Residual charge," Scotty's voice came back, tight with the intensity of someone managing a technical system at its limits. "Maybe 30% of initial, enough for one more pulse." "Hold it," Kirk said. "Wait." The entity was at 200,000 kilometers, 150. The breach was still narrowing, but slowly. The closure rate had stabilized as the fault line energy propagated deeper into the dimensional structure on the other side. Whether it was propagating toward a structural failure or simply dissipating into the larger dimensional volume beyond was something none of their instruments could currently determine. 100,000 kilometers. From the Klothos, a fresh volley of disruptor fire caught the entity across what the sensors approximated as its leading edge, the portion of its dimensional mass most fully present in normal space. Yes, the effect was limited but real, generating energy disruptions that forced the entity to divert processing toward the interference. It slowed, not much, but measurably. "Scotty," Kirk said, "the pulse. Can you target it at the breach aperture specifically? Not through it, at it, at the dimensional boundary itself." A brief pause. "Aye. If I reroute the projection geometry through the secondary emitters, I can do it. It'll take 12 seconds. "Do it." 12 seconds. The entity was at 70,000 kilometers. Kirk watched the closing breach on the sensor display, watched the DoomSlayer's energy signature on the inset display, still active on the other side, still moving, still doing what it did, and held himself very still in the command chair in the way that he held himself still when a plan was either going to work or it wasn't, and the remaining variables were no longer in his hands. "Ready," Scotty said. "Fire," Kirk said. The secondary pulse was smaller than the initial projection. 30% of the buffer's charge focused not through the breach, but at the dimensional boundary surrounding it. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The breach aperture, already contracting, collapsed under the additional energy input along its fault lines. Not slowly, not gradually, but with the sudden, decisive finality of a structural failure that had been approaching its threshold and had just reached it. The breach closed. On the sensor display, the DoomSlayer's energy signature, which had been visible through the diminishing aperture as a moving, active point of concentrated will, disappeared as the dimensional boundary sealed. The bridge was very quiet. The entity at 50,000 kilometers stopped. It held there for 11 seconds, long enough that Kirk found himself counting them, without intending to in the specific way that people counted things when they needed to anchor themselves to something concrete. Then the entity's energy signature began to change. The quality of its presence in local space, the dimensional mass of it, the portion of its structure that existed in their universe, began to diminish, slowly and then with increasing speed, as though something on the other side of the sealed breach was pulling it back. "It's withdrawing," Spock said. "Yes, the energy readings are consistent with a being that has lost its dimensional anchor in local space. Without the breach as an entry point, it cannot maintain full presence in our dimensional framework." He paused. "It is being pulled back into its own dimension by the same physics that previously allowed it to project into ours." "How long?" Kirk asked. "At current rate of dimensional retraction, approximately 4 minutes until its presence in local space falls below detectable thresholds." 4 minutes. Kirk sat in the command chair and watched the entity retract, watched its energy signature diminish from the vast, patient, implacable thing it had been to something smaller, less coherent, less certain of its own boundaries. The Klothos held its position, weapons powered but not firing, Kor apparently making the same calculation Kirk was making. That firing on something in the process of leaving was a wasted expenditure of energy that might also constitute a provocation. 3 minutes. 2. McCoy appeared at Kirk's shoulder. He stood there quietly for a moment, looking at the view screen. Then, in a voice that had stripped itself of everything except the simple, honest weight of what he was feeling. "Jim." "I know," Kirk said quietly. "The breach is sealed," McCoy said. "We can't. There's no way to." "I know, Bones." McCoy was quiet for a moment. "He went through knowing that," he said, "knowing the breach was going to close behind him." Kirk looked at the view screen, at the diminishing entity, at the space where the breach had been, which was now simply space, the same star field it had always been, unchanged and indifferent, carrying no visible record of the tear that had briefly existed in it. "Yes," he said, "he did." 1 minute. The entity's signature dropped below detectable thresholds at 3 minutes and 47 seconds. Spock confirmed its absence from local space with the quiet precision of a scientist closing a dataset. The Klothos held its position for another 30 seconds. Then Kor's voice came through the channel, quieter than it had been at any point in the engagement, carrying the specific quality of a Klingon warrior in the presence of something that had earned silence. "It is gone," Kor said. "Yes," Kirk said. A pause. "The being on the other side of the breach," Kor said. "It knew the closure rate. It went through knowing." "Yes," Kirk said again. Another pause longer. "Kirk," Kor said. "Kirk, in the history of the Klingon Empire, in every account of every Dahar master who ever lived, there is a concept, Hegluma Hea Keku Jajvam." He paused. "It is a good day to die, but it does not mean what outsiders believe it means. It is not a celebration of death. It is the recognition that some causes are worth the cost, that some warriors reach a point where the cost and the cause have become the same thing." His voice was quiet and direct and entirely without performance. "That being understood that, better than anyone I have encountered in 30 years of command." Another pause. "I will remember it." Kirk looked at the star field on the view screen, at the space where the breach had been, at the space where, on the other side of a dimensional boundary that was now sealed, the DoomSlayer was doing what the DoomSlayer had always done. "And so will I," Kirk said. 7 days after the breach sealed, the USS Enterprise was still in the sector. This was unusual. Kirk's standing orders from Starfleet Command, communicated through a Priority 1 channel that Admiral Comac had personally overseen, in the tone of a man who had read Kirk's incident report 3 times and was still not entirely certain he believed it, were to complete a full sensor sweep of the region, document every measurable effect of the dimensional incursion on local space, and return to Starbase 11 for debriefing at the earliest practical opportunity. The earliest practical opportunity, by Comac's reckoning, had been approximately 5 days ago. Kirk had filed 2 extension requests, both citing ongoing scientific observation of anomalous post-incursion phenomena. Both had been approved, and with a terseness in the approval language that communicated Starfleet Command's opinion of the extension requests without technically constituting an objection to them. The real reason Kirk was still in the sector was not the sensor sweep, though the sensor sweep was genuine, and Spock was conducting it with the thorough, systematic attention he brought to all scientific observation. The real reason was less official and more honest. The particular human difficulty of leaving a place where something significant had happened before you had fully understood what had happened there. He was in his captain's quarters on the 6th evening, the report on his desk representing his fourth attempt to write a complete account of the incident for Starfleet's records. When the previous 3 attempts had stalled at different points, once at the description of the DoomSlayer's arrival, once at the account of the entity's communication, and once, most problematically, at the section describing the breach closure. Each time he had found himself confronting the inadequacy of standard incident report language for events that did not fit standard incident report categories. What was the DoomSlayer? The report had a field for species designation. He had written human-derived dimensional variance unknown and felt the inadequacy of it like a physical thing. What was the entity? Hostile extra-dimensional manifestation was accurate as far as it went and went nowhere near far enough. What had happened when the breach closed? He had written interdimensional transit completed and sat looking at the words for a long time before closing the file. He opened it again now and looked at what he had. The door chimed. "Come," he said. Spock entered with the quiet, purposive efficiency of a man who had something specific to communicate and had chosen his moment with the deliberateness that characterized all his choices. He stood in the doorway for a moment, a rare hesitation that Kirk noticed precisely because it was rare, and then moved to stand on the other side of the desk. "You have something," Kirk said. "I have been completing the sensor sweep of the region as ordered," Spock said. "In the course of that sweep, I have detected several phenomena that I believe are relevant to the incident and that I wanted to bring to your attention before including them in my formal report." "Go ahead." Spock clasped his hands behind his back in the posture he adopted when presenting complex findings that he intended to deliver in precise sequence. "The dimensional boundary in this sector has been permanently altered," he said, "not destabilized, in the opposite. The fault lines along which the breach formed have been reinforced by the energy propagation that occurred during our defensive action. The structural integrity of the dimensional boundary in this region is now significantly higher than baseline measurements suggest it should be." He paused. "In practical terms, this means that the probability of a similar breach forming at this location in the future has been reduced by approximately 94%. Kirk absorbed this. The deflector pulse reinforced the boundary. The deflector pulse combined with the DoomSlayer's energy propagation from the other side, Spock said. The combined effect was not merely to close the breach, but to repair the structural weakness that allowed it to form. What was a dimensional fault line is now effectively a dimensional reinforcement." He paused. "The region is, by this measure, more stable than it was before the incursion." Kirk looked at the desk, at the report, at the inadequate words in the species designation field. "And the entity?" he asked. "Watched no detectable presence in local space or in the sensor range immediately adjacent to the dimensional boundary," Spock said. "The readings are consistent with the entity having been fully withdrawn into its home dimension at the point of the breach's closure. Whether that withdrawal was voluntary or forced, whether whatever is behind the entity is regrouping, reassessing, or has been damaged by the DoomSlayer's engagement on the other side, I cannot determine. Our instruments cannot reach beyond the sealed boundary. Can they reach far enough to tell us anything about what's happening on the other side?" Spock considered this for a moment. "Indirectly," he said, "I have been analyzing the energy signature of the dimensional boundary itself, the characteristics of the barrier between our universe and the adjacent dimension. In the hours immediately following the breach closure, those readings were consistent with significant energy activity on the other side. Fluctuations in the boundary's energy profile consistent with large-scale events in the adjacent dimensional space." He paused. "In the past 48 hours, those fluctuations have diminished significantly. The boundary is becoming quieter." Kirk looked at him. "Which could mean the fighting has stopped." "It could mean several things," Spock said carefully. "That the fighting has stopped, that whatever was fighting has moved beyond the range at which its activity is detectable through the boundary, or that the situation on the other side has resolved in some way, in any direction, that has reduced the energy output we were detecting." He paused. "Hono, I am not in a position to tell you which of those interpretations is correct. But you have a preference," Kirk said. He knew Spock well enough to know when the Vulcan's careful neutrality was the product of genuine uncertainty, and when it was the product of a conclusion he was not yet prepared to state with the certainty he preferred. Spock was quiet for a moment. "The energy profile of the boundary," he said, "in its quieter state, in the readings from the past 48 hours, carries a residual signature that I find significant. It is faint, diffuse, distributed across the entire boundary surface rather than concentrated at any single point. He paused. It is the same energy signature as the DoomSlayer's biological readings. Not the entity's signature, the DoomSlayer's. Kirk held very still. It is present throughout the boundary, Spock continued, woven into the dimensional reinforcement that the energy propagation produced, as though the energy that sealed and reinforced the breach, the energy that is now part of the structure of the dimensional wall between our universe and what lies beyond, carries the character of the being that generated it. He paused. It is, in a sense, a permanent feature of this sector of space now, imperceptible to standard instruments, present in the dimensional substrate. Another pause, and this one had a quality that Kirk recognized as the specific silence Spock produced when he was about to say something that he found difficult to express within the bounds of scientific language. If the boundary holds, if the reinforcement is permanent, as current readings suggest, then this region of space will carry that signature indefinitely. Kirk sat with that for a long time. Outside the viewport of his quarters, the stars were what they always were, cold and indifferent and impossibly numerous, the infinite backdrop against which everything that had happened in this sector had played out and been absorbed and would eventually be forgotten by the universe, even if not by the people who had lived through it. But Spock was telling him that somewhere in the dimensional fabric of this particular piece of that backdrop, in the structure of the wall between what he knew and what lay beyond it, something remained. Not a memorial, not a monument, not anything that Starfleet's instruments would detect, or that any future ship passing through this region would register on its sensors. Something that was simply present, that had become part of the place. He thought about Kor's word, Dahar Master. He thought about the face he had seen briefly in the transporter room, the weathered, still ancient-eyed face of a human being who had become something that the word human could contain but not fully describe. He thought about McCoy's question in sickbay, "How long have you been doing this?" And the weight of the silence that had answered it. He thought about a being that had walked through a closing breach without hesitation, into a dimension that its own instruments couldn't fully characterize, to fight a force it had been fighting for longer than the Federation had existed, because that was what it did. Because the cause and the cost had become the same thing. Sarian, the mathematics of that equivalence, left no variable unaccounted for. He picked up the report, looked at the species designation field, deleted human-derived dimensional variants unknown, wrote human, set the report down. Spock had been watching him with the quiet, attentive patience that was one of the qualities Kirk valued most in him. The capacity to be present in a moment without requiring the moment to be something other than what it was. "Captain," he said quietly, "there is one further element of the sensor data that I have not yet mentioned." "Tell me." "The Klothos departed this sector 36 hours ago," Spock said. "Before departing, Commander Kor transmitted a brief message, not on standard Starfleet frequency, on the frequency we use for the tactical coordination during the engagement, a frequency that he apparently understood we would be monitoring." He paused. "The message was in Klingon. I have translated it." "What did it say?" Spock looked at him steadily. He said, "The High Council will not be told the full truth of what occurred here. Some things are above councils. The Klothos bears witness. That is sufficient." A pause. He then transmitted a second message, shorter, 3 words. Another pause. "In the ancient Klingon honorific register, which is rarely used in modern Klingon communication, reserved for occasions that the warrior culture considers, in their framework, sacred." Spock paused one final time. The 3 words were, "We remember you." Kirk looked at the viewport, at the stars. "And we remember you," he said quietly. The Enterprise held its position in the sector for one more day. Kirk spent part of that day on the bridge, part of it in deflector control looking at the field coil readings, the changed, improved, permanently altered coil architecture that Scotty had cataloged and documented and was still not entirely sure how to explain. And part of it simply standing at the viewport of his quarters, looking at the stars the way he sometimes looked at them when something had happened that he needed to carry for a while before he could put it down. On the morning of the 8th day, he gave the order to break orbit and set course for Starbase 11. The Enterprise came around on its new heading with the smooth, powerful grace of a ship that knew its business. The warp engines spinning up with their familiar harmonic, the stars on the view screen shifting and elongating as the ship crossed the threshold into warp. In 7 minutes, the sector where the breach had opened and closed, and a being had walked through it without hesitation, was behind them, falling away at faster-than-light speeds, becoming distance. Kirk sat in the command chair and looked at the view screen and did not look back. In the deflector control room, the modified field coils hummed at their new efficiency, doing their job with the quiet competence of systems that had been improved by something passing through them. In the pattern buffer, the last traces of the stored energy signature had dissipated over the 7 days since the engagement. The buffer fully reset to standard operating parameters, carrying no detectable record of what had been held in it. In the dimensional boundary of the sector they were leaving, in the deep, imperceptible substrate of the wall between universes, something remained that Spock's instruments could barely detect, and that standard Starfleet sensors would not register at all. Uhura, at her communication station, was monitoring standard frequencies with the routine professional attention of an officer on a ship that was no longer at battle stations. She had been quiet for most of the morning, quieter than her usual self, which Kirk had noticed and attributed to the same general weight that was sitting on the bridge as a whole and would likely sit there for a while longer yet. After a few minutes, she looked up from her console. "Captain," she said. Her voice was careful. "Oh, I'm picking up something on the dimensional boundary frequency that Spock established for monitoring the breach site." She paused. "It might be nothing. Residual readings from the reinforced boundary." "What does it look like?" Kirk asked. Uhura listened. She tilted her head slightly, pressing her earpiece against her ear with the focused attention of someone parsing something faint. "It's structured," she said slowly. "It has the character of a modulated signal rather than random background noise. But the signal type..." She paused. "Captain, the universal translator has no framework for it. It's the same general signal architecture as the entity's communication, but the character of it is completely different." She listened for another moment. She stopped. Started again. "It feels intentional, directed, as though something is transmitting toward our dimensional boundary from the other side, toward this sector specifically." She looked up, "But the translator can't resolve it into language. The closest it can get is..." She paused again, listening harder. "The closest it can get is a quality, an intent without grammar, like the entity's transmissions, but what?" Kirk asked quietly. Uhura looked at him. Her expression had the quality of someone who has received something and is not entirely sure how to deliver it without diminishing it in the delivery. "The entity's transmissions felt like pressure," she said carefully. "This feels like the opposite of pressure." She paused. "The translator is rendering it as continuation, as in..." She looked at the console, then back at Kirk. "As in, still going." The bridge was very quiet. Kirk looked at the view screen, at the stars moving past in the elongated streaks of warp travel, at the sector falling away behind them, carrying its reinforced dimensional boundary and its imperceptible energy signature, and whatever the instruments were barely detecting from the other side. Still going. He let that sit for a moment in the quiet of the bridge, held by the people who had been through it with him. Spock, with his steady dark eyes and his carefully maintained neutrality that was its own form of feeling. Sulu with his hands on the helm, and his expression carrying something that had nothing to do with navigation. Chekhov at his console with the particular silence of someone who is young enough to be changed by things and experienced enough to know it. Washu Hura with her hand still on her earpiece, listening to something the translator couldn't fully render. McCoy appeared in the turbolift doorway and stood there for a moment, reading the quality of the bridge's silence the way only McCoy could read it, with the diagnostic instinct of a man who spent his career paying attention to the things people couldn't say. He walked to Kirk's shoulder and stood there without speaking, looking at the view screen. "Bones," Kirk said. "Yeah," McCoy said. "Still going," Kirk said quietly. McCoy was quiet for a moment. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, but occupied the honest space between them. "Of course it is," he said. "What else would it do?" Kirk almost smiled. He straightened in the command chair, looked at the view screen, at the stars. "Kas, Mr. Sulu," he said. "Maintain course and speed." "Aye, Captain," Sulu said. The Enterprise flew on. In the end, Starfleet's official record of the incident designated it as Case File 7714-Delta, an unclassified extra-dimensional incursion of unknown origin, resolved through combined Federation and Klingon tactical response. With full dimensional boundary integrity restored at conclusion, the file was accurate in every detail that the Federation's instruments had been able to measure and record. It was like all official records of things that exceeded the capacity of official language, true but incomplete. What the file did not contain was the sensor reading that Spock had quietly noted in his personal research log, the DoomSlayer's energy signature, present in the dimensional boundary of Sector 7714, it reinforcing the wall between universes with the particular character of a will that had decided very long ago what it was for. The file did not contain Kor's transmission, which the Klothos had encrypted and the High Council had never seen. It did not contain the translation that Uhura had barely managed of a signal from the other side of a sealed dimensional boundary, rendered by an instrument that had no framework for it into a single quality, a single intent. Still going. What the file did not contain, and what no file ever would, was the understanding that Kirk carried forward from that sector. The understanding that the universe was larger than the Federation's instruments and darker than its optimism accounted for, and that somewhere in the dark, moving through dimensions that Starfleet's best science could barely detect, something was still fighting, had always been fighting, would always be fighting. Not because it had been ordered to, not because it hoped for rescue or recognition or resolution, but because it had looked at what stood against it and had decided, with the absolute, irreducible clarity of a being that had reduced itself to its essential truth, that the thing standing against it was wrong, and that for the DoomSlayer had always been enough. The stars were what they always were, cold and indifferent and impossibly numerous. And in the dimensional fabric between them, in the deep and imperceptible substrate of the wall between universes, something remained that no instrument would fully measure and no record would fully capture. Something that was simply present, that had become part of the place. That was still going. Live long and prosper. More stories await.